Welcome to War Sleep Stories. Today, we will be listening to relaxing war stories and sounds to make you fall asleep, but before that, kindly like and subscribe. Thank you.
The 1973 Laotian coup attempt. The sun beat mercilessly upon the tarmac of Wadi International Airport on August 20, 1973. In the distance, a faint hum grew into a deafening roar as an unmarked At-28 aircraft descended rapidly. The pilot was none other than General Tao Ma, a man whose name had once echoed through Laos as both a hero and a rebel. Exiled to Thailand for years, he had spent those days in bitterness, plotting his revenge against the forces that had betrayed him. Now, his time had come. Inside the cockpit, Tao Ma's hands gripped the controls tightly. His heart raced, not with fear but with determination. The plan was simple: seize the airport, take out his rival General Bay, and restore what he believed was justice. But nothing in war ever goes as planned. As the At-28 touched down, a group of loyalists waiting in the shadows exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader was back, and with him came the chaos they had feared. Moments after landing, Tao Ma emerged from the plane, his presence commanding. Clad in his worn pilot's uniform, he was a stark contrast to the polished officers who had taken control of the kingdom in his absence. "We move now," he barked to his small group of supporters. They had no time for pleasantries. The plan required precision, and their margin for error was razor-thin. The first strike was immediate. Tao Ma personally piloted the At-28 again, targeting Kuprasitha's office with deadly accuracy. Explosions rattled the city as black smoke spiraled into the sky. But Kuprasith was nowhere to be found. The loyalist troops, initially caught off guard, began regrouping. What had started as a lightning-fast assault was quickly becoming a game of survival for Tao Ma and his men. As the smoke cleared over Vientiane, Tao Ma's first attack had already sent shockwaves through the capital. Civilians cowered in their homes, unsure of what was unfolding. Military trucks roared through the streets as the loyalist forces scrambled to retake control of Wadi Airport. Kuprasitha Bay, known for his calculating mind, was already working from a secure location, piecing together a counterstrike. Inside the airport, tension was palpable. Tao Ma's men had barricaded the control tower, using it as their base of operations. Their radios buzzed with fragmented reports of loyalist troop movements. "They're mobilizing faster than we thought," one of his men muttered, his voice betraying a hint of fear. Tao Ma shot him a glare. "Then we'll move faster." Tao Ma climbed back into the At-28, his sights now set on Kuprasitha's residence. He knew the stakes were high. His forces were vastly outnumbered, and the airport was only temporarily under his control. Yet, he pressed on, driven by a vendetta that overshadowed all reason. The second airstrike was as precise as the first, but the result was the same: destruction without victory. Kuprasith had outmaneuvered him again. As Tao Ma's aircraft soared back toward the airport, a shadow loomed on the horizon. Loyalist anti-aircraft units had been deployed, and the sky was no longer his domain. The sudden crack of artillery fire shattered the cockpit's calm. Tao Ma's instincts kicked in, and he maneuvered the plane sharply, dodging the first volley. But this was only the beginning. The loyalists were closing in, and the airport was about to become a battlefield. Back at Wadi Airport, the loyalists launched their first offensive. Armed with superior numbers and heavy artillery, they began their march toward the perimeter. Tao Ma's loyalists, though fewer in number, had the advantage of preparation and high ground. From the control tower, they rained gunfire down upon the advancing troops, but the sheer scale of the attack was overwhelming. Inside the control room, Tao Ma's second-in-command, Colonel Boundless Sakasi, studied a map with grim focus. "We can't hold this position forever," he said, his voice low. Tao Ma, standing by the window, watched the firefight unfold below. "We're not leaving," he replied firmly. "If we fall here." As night fell, the airport descended into chaos. Flashes of gunfire illuminated the darkness, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke. Civilians who had sought refuge near the airport were now caught in the crossfire, their cries of terror blending with the cacophony of war. Among them was a young woman named Sohn, a nurse who had volunteered to help the wounded. Her story would soon intertwine with the larger conflict in ways she could never have imagined. Meanwhile, Kuprasitha's forces tightened their grip. A loyalist commander, Sarith Don Sasarit, ordered his men to cut off all supply routes to the airport. "We'll starve them out if we have to," he declared. The siege was underway, and Tao Ma's options were dwindling. The morning brought no relief. Trapped within the airport's confines, Tao Ma's men faced a grim reality. Supplies were running low, morale was crumbling, and the loyalists showed no sign of retreating. Yet, amid the despair, there were moments of unyielding loyalty. Soldiers who had fought alongside Tao Ma in previous battles stood by him now, even as death loomed closer. In a small makeshift infirmary within the airport, Sohn worked tirelessly to tend to the wounded. Her hands were steady, but her heart was heavy. She overheard fragments of conversations among the soldiers, a mix of defiance and doubt. "Why are we still here?" one asked bitterly. Another replied, "Because Tao Ma hasn't given up." For Tao Ma, the weight of his decisions was becoming unbearable. In his private moments, he wrestled with the possibility that his cause was doomed. Yet, he refused to show weakness to his men. "We fight until the end," he told them, his voice unwavering. It was a sentiment that inspired some and condemned others. The siege continued, and the loyalists began preparing for a final assault. Kuprasit, ever the strategist, knew that breaking Tao Ma's spirit was key. He ordered his forces to unleash psychological warfare, broadcasting messages that painted Tao Ma as a reckless traitor who had led his men into a suicide mission. The messages echoed through the airport, sowing seeds of doubt. But Tao Ma remained resolute, even as the walls closed in around him. Just before dawn, an eerie silence fell over Wadi Airport. The gunfire had ceased, replaced by the distant hum of approaching vehicles. Tao Ma stood on the control tower's balcony, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the loyalists were preparing for something, but the quiet unnerved him. "They're up to something," he muttered to Colonel Boundless, who nodded grimly. But the loyalists weren't the only ones planning. Inside the airport, whispers of dissent began to circulate. Some of Tao Ma's men, exhausted and disillusioned, started questioning his leadership. Among them was Lieutenant Bong, a young officer whose fear of death was starting to outweigh his loyalty. As the night stretched on, Bong made a fateful decision. He slipped away from his post and radioed the loyalists, offering to provide intel in exchange for safe passage out of the airport. By the time Bong's betrayal was discovered, it was too late. Loyalist troops were already advancing under the cover of darkness, using the gaps in Tao Ma's defenses that Bong had revealed. The first explosion rocked the southern hangar, catching Tao Ma's forces off guard. "They've found our weak points," Boundless shouted, rushing to mobilize the remaining men. Tao Ma's fury was palpable. "We've been betrayed," he growled, slamming his fist against the control panel. But there was no time to dwell on it. The loyalists were closing in, and the battle for the airport was entering its most dangerous phase. As dawn broke, the airport became a war zone. Loyalist troops stormed the perimeter, their heavy artillery tearing through barricades. Tao Ma, piloting his At-28 one last time, launched desperate airstrikes against the advancing forces. His attacks were precise, but the Loyalists' numbers were overwhelming. Sohn, the young nurse, found herself in the middle of the chaos. The makeshift infirmary was under fire, and she scrambled to move the wounded to safety. "Stay low," she shouted, guiding a soldier with a shrapnel wound toward a storage room. Her courage inspired those around her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their efforts were futile. Meanwhile, Tao Ma's loyalists fought fiercely, knowing they were outnumbered but refusing to surrender. Among them was Sergeant Kem Suk, a seasoned soldier who had followed Tao Ma through countless battles. As the loyalists pushed closer, Kem Suk led a counterattack, buying precious time for the others to regroup. But his heroism came at a cost. A mortar shell struck his position, and Kem Suk fell, his final words a plea for his comrades to keep fighting. Tao Ma witnessed the explosion from his cockpit, and his resolve hardened. "We can't let them take the airport," he radioed to Boundless. But even as he said the words, he knew the odds were against them. By midday, the Loyalists had breached the main terminal. The control tower was their final target, and Tao Ma's forces were running out of ammunition. Boundless turned to his commander, desperation in his eyes. "We need to retreat," he urged. But Tao Ma refused. "If we leave now, everything we've fought for will be lost." The Loyalists' final assault was relentless. They stormed the control tower, forcing Tao Ma and his men into a last stand. Sohn, still tending to the wounded, heard the chaos and realized the end was near. She clutched a makeshift bandage in her hands, her mind racing with thoughts of survival. As the Loyalists closed in, Tao Ma made a daring decision. He ordered his remaining men to evacuate through an underground passage, a route known only to a select few. "Go," he told Boundless. "I'll hold them off." Boundless hesitated but eventually nodded, leading the survivors toward the passage. Tao Ma remained in the control tower, his At-28 grounded and his ammunition depleted. When the Loyalists finally reached him, they found a man unbroken in spirit. Kuprasitha's men dragged him from the wreckage, and though he fought them with every ounce of strength, his fate was sealed. Tao Ma's capture marked the end of the coup attempt, but his death would become its most haunting chapter. The Loyalists wasted no time in exacting their revenge. Under Kuprasitha's orders, Tao Ma was executed on the tarmac of Wadi Airport, a grim warning to anyone who dared to challenge the regime. Sohn, who had been captured along with other survivors, witnessed the execution from a distance. She felt a mix of anger and helplessness as the man who had led the rebellion was silenced forever. "This isn't justice," she whispered to herself, her tears falling silently. For Kuprasit, the victory was bittersweet. Though the coup had been quashed, the cost of the conflict was evident. Wadi Airport lay in ruins, and the capital was reeling from the violence. Yet, Kuprasitha's position was secure, and he wasted no time consolidating his power. As news of Tao Ma's death spread, whispers of his courage began to circulate. Among the civilians and soldiers who had supported him, he became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there were those willing to fight for what they believed in. The tarmac at Wadi Airport remained stained with blood as the sun dipped below the horizon. General Tao Ma's lifeless body lay sprawled where he had been executed, a stark reminder of the consequences of rebellion. Yet, even in death, his presence lingered in the minds of his captors. Some whispered that his ghost would haunt those who betrayed him, while others simply struggled with the guilt of executing a man who had fought for his beliefs. Among the loyalist troops, a sense of unease began to spread. Soldiers who had celebrated the victory earlier now found themselves haunted by small, inexplicable events. Radios crackled with static, the faint sound of a voice breaking through. "You will never win," it hissed before fading. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of the airport's ruins, and whispers echoed in the still air. It was enough to unsettle even the most hardened men. Meanwhile, Son and the other captured rebels were herded into a makeshift prison near the airport. The conditions were harsh, but it was the psychological torment that weighed most heavily on them. Every day, the guards reminded them of their failure, mocking Tao Ma's failed coup and the futility of their cause. Yet, amid the despair, a spark of resistance remained. Son, though exhausted and afraid, began quietly rallying the others. "You think it's over," she whispered to a fellow prisoner one night. "But it's not. Tao Ma may be gone, but his fight isn't finished." Her words carried through the dimly lit room, planting seeds of hope in the hearts of those who had lost everything. In the days following the coup, General Kuprasitha Bey worked tirelessly to solidify his control. He ordered a purge of anyone suspected of sympathizing with Tao Ma, arresting soldiers, civilians, and even government officials. Yet, despite his outward confidence, a lingering fear gnawed at him. Tao Ma's loyalists were still out there, and Kuprasith knew that rebellions had a way of rising from the ashes. As the loyalist forces combed through the airport's wreckage, they uncovered a hidden compartment beneath the control tower. Inside, they found maps, coded messages, and a logbook detailing Tao Ma's plans. But there was something else, an encrypted file that none of the soldiers could decipher. Kuprasitha's advisors speculated that it contained the names of Tao Ma's remaining allies, a potential network of resistance that could pose a threat to his regime. Desperate for answers, Kuprasith brought in a cryptographer to decode the file. The tension in the room was palpable as the man worked, his fingers flying over the typewriter. Hours passed, and then finally, he looked up. "It's not just names," he said, his voice trembling. "It's a plan, a second phase of the coup." Kuprasitha's face darkened. If Tao Ma had truly prepared for his death, then the loyalists' victory was far from assured. Somewhere out there, his enemies were regrouping, and time was running out to stop them. Far from the chaos of the airport, a small group of Tao Ma's most loyal followers had managed to escape through the underground passage. Among them was Boundless Sekasi, who now found himself leading a ragtag band of rebels deep into the Laotian jungle. Their supplies were scarce, and their morale was low, but Boundless refused to give up. "We owe it to Tao Ma," he told his men one night as they huddled around a small fire. "He gave his life for this cause. We can't let it end here." His words struck a chord with the others, rekindling a sense of purpose. But as they plotted their next move, they were unaware that Kuprasitha's forces were closing in. A loyalist scout team had picked up their trail, and the jungle was alive with danger. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf set the rebels on edge. One night, as they rested in a secluded clearing, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. "They found us," Boundless whispered, motioning for his men to scatter. The loyalists attacked with brutal efficiency, their rifles cutting through the night. Chaos erupted as the rebels fought to defend themselves. Boundless managed to lead a small group to safety, but the cost was high. Several of his men were captured, and the jungle, once their sanctuary, had become a deadly trap. Among the rebels captured during the skirmish was a young courier named Chan. He was known for his quick wit and unwavering loyalty to Tao Ma, but now he found himself bound and beaten in a loyalist camp. Kuprasitha's officers interrogated him relentlessly, demanding information about the remaining rebels. Chan, despite his injuries, refused to break. "You've already killed our leader," he said defiantly. "What more do you want?" His captors sneered, their frustration growing. They had underestimated his resolve, and it was clear that breaking him would not be easy. But Chan held a secret, a small piece of paper hidden in the sole of his boot. It contained the coordinates of a hidden supply cache left by Tao Ma before the coup. The cache was crucial to the rebels' survival, and Chan knew he couldn't let it fall into loyalist hands. One night, as the loyalists celebrated their apparent victory, Chan made his move. Using a shard of glass he had hidden during his capture, he cut through his bindings and slipped into the shadows. The loyalists didn't notice his absence until it was too late. By then, Chan was already deep in the jungle, racing to deliver the vital information to Baumwood and the remaining rebels. Chan's escape from the loyalist camp was nothing short of miraculous. His body ached with every step, his wounds stinging from the relentless jungle air. The paper hidden in his boot felt heavier with every passing mile, a reminder of what was at stake. The loyalists would not take his escape lightly. They would be hunting him. The jungle, once a haven, now felt suffocating. Every rustle of leaves or chirp of insects set his nerves on edge. As he pressed forward, a sudden sound stopped him dead in his tracks. Voices. The loyalists were closing in. Chan dropped to the ground, pressing himself against the roots of a massive tree. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on fallen leaves. Chan's heart pounded as he held his breath. One wrong move, one misplaced step, and it would all be over. He gripped the shard of glass he'd used to free himself, the only weapon he had left. Just as a beam of flashlight swept dangerously close, a branch snapped in the distance. The loyalists turned their attention toward the noise, their voices sharp with urgency. Chan seized the moment, slipping away silently into the thick undergrowth. Whatever had distracted them had saved his life, but he knew his ordeal was far from over. Chan finally reached the rendezvous point, a remote clearing deep in the jungle where Tao Ma's hidden supply cache was buried. Exhausted but determined, he began digging with his bare hands, ignoring the pain as his nails clawed through the earth. After what felt like an eternity, his fingers struck something solid. He unearthed a wooden crate, its surface weathered but intact. Inside were weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies, everything the rebels needed to continue their fight. But there was something else, a sealed envelope marked with Tao Ma's personal insignia. Chan hesitated before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note from Tao Ma himself, detailing his vision for the resistance. "If you are reading this, I am likely gone," the note began. "But the fight must continue. You must rally the people and remind them that our cause is just. The future of Laos depends on your courage." The words hit Chan like a bolt of lightning. Tao Ma had prepared for this moment, even anticipating his own death. With renewed determination, Chan gathered the supplies and set off to find Baumwood and the remaining rebels. But he knew the loyalists wouldn't stop hunting him, and time was running out. Unbeknownst to Chan, the loyalists had intercepted a fragment of radio chatter between the rebels. They didn't know the exact location of the cache, but they had narrowed it down to a section of the jungle. Kuprasita's top officer, Sarith Don Sasarit, personally led the search, determined to crush the last remnants of resistance. Sarith was a cunning strategist, and he knew that brute force wouldn't be enough to root out the rebels. Instead, he set a trap. Loyalist troops scattered false intel across the jungle, hoping to lure the rebels into an ambush. They planted fake supply caches and rigged them with explosives, waiting for the rebels to take the bait. As Chan navigated the jungle with the real supplies, he noticed subtle signs of disturbance, broken branches, footprints, and the faint smell of gunpowder. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he pressed on. The rebels couldn't afford to lose these supplies. Finally, he spotted a group of figures in the distance. At first, relief washed over him. He thought they were Bournemouth's men. But as he crept closer, the truth became clear. They were loyalists, waiting in ambush. Chan froze, realizing he had walked straight into Sauratha's trap. Chan's mind raced as he crouched behind a tree, watching the loyalists patrol the area. They hadn't spotted him yet, but it was only a matter of time. The crate of supplies was too heavy to carry far, and leaving it behind wasn't an option. He remembered Tao Ma's note, the weight of its words giving him courage. If this is the end, he thought, I won't go down without a fight. Chan carefully retrieved a grenade from the crate, his hands trembling as he pulled the pin. The explosion shattered the jungle's silence, sending the loyalists scrambling. In the chaos, Chan grabbed the crate and bolted. Bullets whizzed past him as the loyalists opened fire, their shouts echoing through the trees. Chan ducked and weaved, his body moving on pure adrenaline. By some miracle, he managed to evade the gunfire and disappear into the dense jungle. But his relief was short-lived. The loyalists would regroup quickly, and now they knew someone had reached the cache. Chan needed to find the rebels fast, or the supplies, and his life, would be lost. Chan's strength was failing, and the crate of supplies felt heavier with every step. His clothes were soaked with sweat, and his wounds from the loyalist camp throbbed painfully. The jungle seemed to conspire against him, with vines and roots tangling his feet and sharp branches clawing at his skin. But he pushed forward, driven by the memory of Tao Ma's words and the knowledge that the fate of the rebellion rested on his shoulders. Just as despair began to creep in, he heard faint voices carried on the wind. Instinctively, Chan crouched low, unsure if they were friend or foe. Peering through the foliage, he spotted a group of armed men gathered near a stream. His heart skipped a beat, these were no loyalists. The red armbands they wore marked them as Tao Ma's surviving rebels. Summoning the last of his strength, Chan stumbled into the clearing. The rebels immediately raised their weapons, their faces tense. Wait! It's me, Chan, he called out, collapsing to his knees. Bournemouth rushed forward, his expression shifting from suspicion to relief. You're alive, Bournemouth said, helping him up. And you found the supplies. As the rebels opened the crate and marveled at its contents, Chan handed Bournemouth the sealed letter. Tao Ma left this for you, he said, his voice hoarse. Bournemouth read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. When he finished, he looked up at his men, his eyes burning with determination. Tao Ma's fight isn't over, he said. We regroup, we rebuild, and we strike back. While the rebels celebrated Chan's return, a shadow loomed over their camp. Unbeknownst to them, one of their own had been turned. Vong, the same lieutenant who had betrayed Tao Ma at Wadi Airport, had rejoined the rebels under the pretense of loyalty. But his real purpose was far more sinister. Vong's betrayal hadn't ended with revealing the airport's weak points. After escaping the loyalist camp, he had struck a deal with Saurith Don Saisworth. In exchange for his freedom, Vong had agreed to infiltrate the remaining rebels and feed the loyalists their location. Now, as the rebels plotted their next move, Vong silently observed, memorizing every detail. That night, as the rebels slept, Vong slipped away to make contact with the loyalists. Using a concealed radio, he transmitted the coordinates of the camp. They're vulnerable, he whispered. Strike now, and you'll crush them once and for all. But Vong's message didn't go unnoticed. Chan, ever vigilant, had followed him into the jungle and overheard the conversation. Rage boiled within him as he realized the extent of Vong's treachery. Chan returned to the camp, his mind racing. If he exposed Vong immediately, the loyalists might attack before the rebels could prepare. He needed to outthink the traitor, and fast. Chan acted quickly, pulling Baumluth aside and explaining everything he had heard. "We can't let him know we're onto him," Chan said. "If we play this right, we can turn his betrayal against them." Baumluth nodded, his expression grim. "What do you have in mind?" They devised a plan to feed false information back to the loyalists. Chan and Baumluth spread rumors throughout the camp, making it seem as though the rebels were planning to relocate to a nearby cave system. Vong, eager to prove his usefulness to the loyalists, took the bait and relayed the false coordinates. The loyalists launched their attack at dawn, descending upon the empty caves with overwhelming force. Saurith himself led the charge, confident that this was the end of the rebellion. But when his troops found nothing but silence and shadows, he realized too late that he had been deceived. Meanwhile, the rebels lay in wait near the loyalist camp. Using the supplies Chan had recovered, they launched a surprise attack, catching Saurith's forces off guard. Explosions lit up the jungle as the rebels struck with precision, dismantling the loyalist operation piece by piece. In the chaos of the battle, Vong tried to slip away, but Chan was waiting for him. "You thought you could betray us and get away with it?" Chan growled, stepping into Vong's path. The traitor's face twisted in fear as he realized there was no escape. Vong raised his hands, his voice trembling. "Please, Chan. I did it to survive. I didn't have a choice." But Chan's resolve was unshakable. "You had a choice," he said. "And you chose to betray Tao Ma and everyone who trusted you." The other rebels gathered around, their faces filled with anger and betrayal. Baumluth stepped forward, his voice steady. "Justice will be served," he declared. Vong's fate was sealed, and his execution sent a clear message to anyone who might consider turning against the rebellion. As the dust settled and the rebels regrouped, Baumluth addressed his men. "We've struck a blow against the loyalists, but this war is far from over. Tao Ma's dream lives on, and we will not rest until it becomes a reality." The men cheered, their spirits renewed. But in the distance, Kuprasith was already planning his next move. The failed ambush had enraged him, and he vowed to crush the rebellion once and for all. The battle for Laos was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The failed ambush left General Kuprasith seething. Pacing in his command tent, he barked orders at his officers, his temper barely restrained. How could they outsmart us? We outnumber them, outgun them, and yet they still slip through our grasp. His frustration turned into cold resolve. If brute force couldn't end the rebellion, then cunning would. Saurith Don Sacerith, battered but alive after the failed attack, approached with a proposal. "General," he said cautiously, "we need a new strategy. The rebels thrive on secrecy. We can't fight them blindly. But what if we plant a mole of our own among their ranks?" Kuprasith's lips curled into a grim smile. "Do it. And this time, make sure we don't fail." The loyalists staged an elaborate ruse, capturing a rebel sympathizer named Cam and forcing him into their service. Under the threat of death for his family, Cam was ordered to infiltrate the rebel camp and deliver intelligence. Cam, though unwilling, was left with no choice. With fake scars and a fabricated story of escape, he was sent into the jungle to find the rebels. Meanwhile, Kuprasith ordered the construction of a secret forward base closer to the rebel stronghold. The base would serve as the launch pad for an all-out assault, timed to coincide with Cam's betrayal. The clock was ticking, and the loyalists were playing a dangerous game. Cam stumbled into the rebel camp, his face pale and his clothes torn. He collapsed at the edge of the perimeter, drawing the attention of the sentries. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, raising his rifle. I'm one of you," Cam gasped, clutching his side. "They captured me, but I escaped." The sentries brought him to Boundless, who eyed the newcomer suspiciously. "You claim you escaped from the loyalists?" Boundless asked, his tone cold. Cam nodded, his voice trembling. "They were going to kill me. I barely made it out." Though Boundless's instincts told him to be cautious, the rebels were desperate for reinforcements. After a tense interrogation, Cam was allowed to stay under strict supervision. Chan, however, wasn't convinced. He watched Cam closely, his suspicion growing with every passing day. Cam, for his part, was racked with guilt. Every time he looked into the faces of the rebels, he saw courage and determination, qualities he felt he lacked. But the thought of his family kept him silent. He fed small pieces of information back to the loyalists, careful not to reveal too much too soon. Yet, with each lie he told, the weight on his conscience grew heavier. As Cam worked to gain the rebels' trust, Kuprasith prepared his forces for the final strike. The forward base was nearly complete, its location hidden deep in the jungle. Loyalist troops trained relentlessly, their morale bolstered by the promise of victory. One night, as Cam wandered the camp, he overheard Chan and Boundless discussing a plan to move the rebels to a more secure location. "We'll strike the loyalist supply lines along the way," Boundless said. "It's a risk, but it's our best chance to weaken them." Cam relayed the plan to Kuprasith, who saw an opportunity to crush the rebels once and for all. He ordered his forces to intercept the rebels during their relocation, using Cam's intel to set a deadly trap. But Cam, tormented by his actions, began to waver. He had seen the rebels' humanity and courage, and the thought of leading them to their deaths filled him with dread. The night before the rebels were set to move, Cam approached Chan, his face pale. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice trembling. Chan's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Cam hesitated, his words caught in his throat. But before he could speak, a gunshot echoed through the camp. The loyalists had arrived early. The loyalist attack was swift and brutal. Explosions tore through the camp as the rebels scrambled to defend themselves. Cam, caught in the chaos, froze as the reality of his actions came crashing down. He had given the loyalists their position, and now the people he had come to admire were paying the price. Chan spotted Cam standing motionless amidst the firefight. "What did you do?" he shouted, grabbing him by the collar. Cam's silence was all the confirmation Chan needed. Rage consumed him, but before he could act, a mortar shell struck nearby, throwing them both to the ground. Boundless rallied the remaining rebels, organizing a desperate counterattack. "Fall back," he ordered, leading his men into the jungle. The loyalists pressed forward, but the dense foliage and the rebels' knowledge of the terrain allowed them to slip away. In the aftermath, Cam was brought before the surviving rebels. "You betrayed us," Boundless said, his voice cold. "Why?" Tears streamed down Cam's face as he explained the loyalists' threats against his family. "I didn't want this," he pleaded. "I was trying to protect them." The rebels were divided on what to do with him. Some called for his execution, while others argued that he had been a victim of the loyalists' cruelty. In the end, Boundless made the decision. Your life is spared, he said. But you will prove your loyalty by helping us destroy Kupersika's forward base. Cam's reprieve came with a heavy price. The rebels' decision to spare him was not unanimous, and distrust hung in the air like a storm cloud. Every move he made was closely watched, and he knew his survival depended on proving his worth. But the task before him was monumental: lead the rebels to the loyalist forward base he had unwittingly enabled and help dismantle it from the inside. Under Baumlutha's command, the rebels planned their approach. The jungle around the base was heavily patrolled, and the loyalists had fortified their position with trenches and machine gun nests. "We can't take it by force," Baumluth said during a strategy meeting. "We'll need to strike from within and sabotage their defenses before launching an assault." Cam, familiar with the base's layout from his time with the Loyalists, sketched out the fortifications. "The armory is here," he said, pointing to a cluster of buildings near the center. "If we can set it off, it'll cripple their defenses and create enough chaos for the rest of you to move in." The plan was set, but the rebels knew the risks. This mission would determine whether they could survive as a fighting force, or be extinguished entirely. As they prepared to move, Baumluth addressed his men. "We fight not just for Tao Ma's vision, but for the people of Laos," he said. "No matter the odds, we will not falter." Disguised as a loyalist courier, Cam entered the forward base under the cover of darkness. His heart raced as he passed checkpoints, each glance from a guard feeling like a blade at his throat. The base was a hive of activity, with troops preparing for another assault on the rebels. Cam's stomach churned at the thought that he had helped make this possible. He located the armory quickly, its guards stationed lazily at the entrance. Cam's plan relied on subtlety. He couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. He feigned a minor accident, spilling a crate of ammunition nearby. As the guards helped him clean up, he slipped a small timed explosive into the armory's supply room. Meanwhile, the rest of the rebels crept closer to the base, using the jungle's dense foliage for cover. Baumluth led the vanguard, his rifle at the ready. "Wait for the signal," he whispered to his men. They could see the base's floodlights sweeping through the trees, and the tension was suffocating. As Cam exited the armory, he saw Saurith Don Sacerith, the loyalist commander, giving orders nearby. For a moment, their eyes met, and Cam felt his blood run cold. Did he recognize me? Cam thought, quickening his pace toward the designated rendezvous point. The timer on the explosive was ticking down, and the rebels' lives depended on his success. The explosion tore through the night, shattering the quiet with a deafening roar. Flames erupted from the armory, sending shockwaves through the base. Loyalist soldiers scrambled in confusion, shouting orders and searching for the source of the blast. It was the chaos the rebels had been waiting for. Baumluth led the charge, his men storming the base from multiple directions. Gunfire erupted as the rebels clashed with the disoriented loyalists. Chan fought alongside his comrades, his sharp instincts guiding him through the chaos. "Focus on the fuel depot," he shouted, knowing that disabling it would further cripple the loyalists. Cam, still inside the base, used the confusion to his advantage. He sabotaged communication lines and unlocked prisoner cells, freeing civilians who had been captured by the loyalists. Among them was a young man who recognized Cam from their village. "You're the reason we're here," the man hissed, his face twisted in anger. Cam didn't deny it. "Then let me be the reason you get out," he said, handing the man a weapon. As the battle raged on, Saurith rallied his troops. "Don't let them break through," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. But even as he fought to hold the line, he knew the base's defenses were crumbling. The rebels had outmaneuvered him, and the tide of the battle was turning against the Loyalists. By dawn, the Loyalist forward base was in ruins. Fires burned uncontrollably, and the remaining Loyalist forces had either fled or surrendered. The rebels stood victorious, but the cost was high. Several of their own had fallen in the assault, and the weight of those losses hung heavy over the survivors. Cam emerged from the wreckage, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. He approached Balmuth, his expression one of quiet resolve. "I did what you asked," he said. Balmuth nodded, his tone softening. "You've earned your place among us, Cam. But redemption isn't just about one act. It's about what you do moving forward." As the rebels regrouped, Balmuth delivered a somber speech. "We've dealt a significant blow to Kuprasitha's forces, but this fight is far from over. They will come for us again, and we must be ready." His words were met with a mix of cheers and solemn nods. In Vientiane, the news of the base's destruction reached Kuprasith. His fury was unmatched. "They've gone too far," he growled. "I want every rebel hunted down and eliminated. No mercy." He ordered a massive mobilization of Loyalist forces, preparing for a final campaign to crush the rebellion. Current status of the operation: the destruction of the Loyalist forward base marks a turning point in the conflict, but the operation is not yet complete. The rebels have scored a major victory, but Kuprasitha's forces remain a formidable threat. The fight for Laos is still underway, with greater stakes and challenges ahead. The Battle of Ban Padong. The sun barely broke through the dense Laotian jungle as Vang Pao, the seasoned Hmong commander, stood silently, watching Ban Padong's horizon. Smoke curled from the makeshift chimneys, the smell of cooking rice mixing with the sharp scent of gunpowder. His small force, mostly made up of Hmong guerrilla trainees, was ill-equipped but determined. Behind him, the muffled sounds of drills hinted at their fragile preparation. The Pathet Lao forces, bolstered by North Vietnamese troops, were closing in, and time was slipping away like water through fingers. A scout scrambled into the camp, his face pale. "General Pao," he whispered, "their artillery positions are moving closer. They're bringing in the 75mm howitzers." The words were enough to freeze the air around them. Those howitzers had already caused significant damage in skirmishes up north. The young soldiers listening in tried to keep their expressions steady, but their nervous glances betrayed them. Pao knew they could not hold this position for long. The village was not just a tactical point but also a symbol of hope for the Royalist forces. It was a sanctuary for training and planning. Losing it would be more than a military defeat, it would be a devastating blow to the morale of the Hmong people fighting for their survival. A distant rumble broke the silence. The first artillery shell screamed through the air, smashing into the edge of the camp. Dirt and debris showered over the soldiers as chaos erupted. Pao clenched his fists. "Prepare the defenses," he shouted. The battle for Ban Padong had begun. Pathet Lao soldiers, hidden in the dense foliage, advanced in eerie silence. Their movements were calculated and precise, guided by Vietnamese advisors who knew every inch of the terrain. On the opposite side, Hmong soldiers scrambled to positions, their unpolished drills betraying their inexperience. The two mortar teams that Pao had positioned fired off the first offensive strikes. The explosions shook the jungle, momentarily halting the enemy's advance. Among the Hmong trainees was a young recruit named Cao. Barely 18, he had joined the fight after witnessing his village razed by communist forces. Clutching his rifle, Cao couldn't stop the tremor in his hands. His older comrade, Cheng, grabbed his shoulder. "Breathe, brother," Cheng said, his voice calm despite the chaos. Remember, we're fighting for our people. For our families. The Pathet Lao soldiers retaliated with a barrage of gunfire, forcing Cao and Cheng to duck behind sandbags. Screams echoed as one of the Hmong gunners was hit, his body slumping over the mortar. Cao felt his stomach churn, but Cheng's firm grip steadied him. Focus. Aim, Cheng instructed. Cao raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He fired, the recoil jolting his shoulder. Through the smoke, he saw a shadow fall. Had he hit someone? There was no time to process. Another shell exploded nearby, throwing him backward. As the dust settled, Cao's ears rang, and he found himself staring at Cheng's lifeless body. In the American embassy in Vientiane, the mood was tense. CIA operative Bill Lair received the grim news about Ban Pa Dong. The royalist base was on the verge of collapse. Lair, who had been instrumental in organizing the Hmong guerrillas under Operation Momentum, knew the stakes. If Ban Pa Dong fell, the communists would gain an unshakable foothold in northern Laos. "Get me Washington," Lair barked into the secure phone line. "We need more support, airdrops, ammo, anything we can get. The Hmong can't hold out without it." His request met resistance. Washington was reluctant to escalate involvement, fearing international backlash. Meanwhile, back at the base, Bang Pao made a daring decision. He ordered his radio operator to signal an emergency request for air support. The message was clear: enemy artillery closing in. Request immediate bombing runs. The operator hesitated. Pao's plan was bold but risky. If the coordinates were even slightly off, friendly forces could be hit. Hours passed with no response. Then, just as hope began to wane, the roar of American planes shattered the sky. F-100 Super Sabres streaked overhead, dropping bombs that lit up the jungle. The ground shook violently, and the Pathet Lao advance was momentarily halted. Pao allowed himself a brief smile. "We fight another day," he muttered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness enveloped Ban Pa Dong. The ceasefire was temporary, giving both sides a chance to regroup. Pao's men worked tirelessly, fortifying their defenses under the dim glow of lanterns. In the distance, a pair of figures emerged from the jungle. It was a scouting team sent earlier to gather intelligence. They brought chilling news. "The communists are planning a night assault," one of them reported, his voice trembling. "They'll use the cover of darkness to infiltrate." Pao's mind raced. He knew his men were exhausted. Many had not slept in days. He gathered his commanders, laying out a daring counterplan. "We'll set traps along the jungle paths and create kill zones," he explained. "If they come, we make them pay dearly for every inch." As midnight approached, tension gripped the camp. Cao, still shaken by the day's events, gripped his rifle tightly. Every rustle in the jungle felt like an enemy. Suddenly, a flare lit up the sky, signaling the start of the assault. Shadows moved swiftly among the trees, and gunfire erupted once more. The night became a cacophony of screams, explosions, and the relentless chatter of machine guns. Amid the chaos, Cao found himself face to face with a Pathet Lao soldier. Their eyes locked for a brief moment before Cao pulled the trigger. The soldier fell, and Cao's hands began to shake uncontrollably. Victory that night came at a steep cost. The Hmong forces had held their ground, but at dawn, as Pao surveyed the battlefield littered with bodies, he realized the true weight of the conflict. Every life lost chipped away at his spirit. As the sun rose over Ban Pa Dong, the jungle revealed the devastation of the night's battle. Smoke hung in the air, mixing with the stench of blood and burned vegetation. Vang Pao inspected his remaining forces, counting the cost of survival. The losses were grim. Many Hmong fighters had fallen, and supplies were running dangerously low. While morale wavered, one of the scouts returned, pale and breathless. "General, the enemy isn't retreating. They're circling around us," he gasped. "They've cut off the main supply route." Panic rippled through the camp. If the Pathet Lao severed their connection to reinforcements, Van Pa Dong would become a death trap. Pao knew he needed a solution, and fast. He called for Lieutenant Thom, a seasoned tracker with an uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous jungle paths. "Find me another way out," Pao ordered. "The lives of everyone here depend on it." Thom disappeared into the underbrush with a small team, but hours turned into a tense day with no word. As the camp braced for another attack, whispers of doubt spread. Some feared Thom's team had been captured, or worse. But late that evening, the tracker returned, his clothes torn and his face hardened. "I found a path," he said grimly, "but the communists are watching it too. We'll have to move under their noses." Pao's forces prepared for a daring maneuver. Under the cover of darkness, a small group would lead the enemy away from Ban Pa Dong, feigning retreat while the main force slipped through the hidden trail. The decoy team, known as the Ghost Battalion, was composed of volunteers who knew the risks. Cao, still grappling with the weight of his first kill, was among them. His determination to prove himself overshadowed his fear. "I want to fight," he told Pao when asked if he was ready. Pao studied the young recruit's trembling hands but nodded. At midnight, the Ghost Battalion set out. They moved silently, their steps deliberate, as they planted false tracks and staged sounds of movement to lure the enemy. Hours later, Pathet Lao forces took the bait, pursuing the decoys deep into the jungle. But something was wrong. Cheng, who led the Ghost Battalion, stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The jungle had gone deathly quiet, a bad omen. Before they could react, enemy mortars erupted around them. The communists had anticipated the ruse. Cao and the others dove for cover, chaos consuming them. As the smoke cleared, only half the Ghost Battalion remained. Cao, bloodied but alive, dragged himself to Cheng, who lay mortally wounded. "Go," Cheng coughed, pushing him away. "Warn Pao. The enemy knows." Cao hesitated, tears streaming down his face, before obeying. He stumbled back toward Ban Pa Dong, leaving behind the men who had sacrificed themselves for the greater good. When Cao returned to the camp, he was greeted as a survivor, but the news he carried darkened the atmosphere. "The Pathet Lao know about the trail," Cao gasped. "They're coming." Pao's face turned ashen. The hidden escape route, their last hope, was compromised. As the commanders gathered to decide their next move, whispers of doubt and fear turned into something more sinister. A captured Pathet Lao soldier, dragged into the camp earlier, claimed there was a traitor among the Hmong ranks. "Someone is feeding them your movements," the prisoner sneered before falling silent under interrogation. Suspicion spread like wildfire. Fighters who had trained together began to eye one another with mistrust. Even Cao couldn't escape the shadow of doubt, his survival from the ambush now viewed as suspicious by some. "I'm not a traitor," he yelled, but his protests only deepened the rift. Pao intervened before the division could escalate further. "We fight together or we die alone," he said firmly. "Whoever the traitor is will be dealt with in time. For now, our focus is survival." But even as he spoke, Pao felt a gnawing unease. Could one of his own truly betray them? The next morning brought no respite. The Pathet-Lao launched a brutal artillery barrage, shaking the ground and tearing through the camp's defenses. The Hmong fighters scrambled to hold their positions, but the enemy's relentless assault seemed unstoppable. Amid the chaos, Pao ordered an emergency evacuation. "We can't hold Van Pa Dong," he admitted to his commanders. "But we won't let them take us without a fight." He tasked his remaining mortar teams to lay down suppressive fire while the troops retreated toward the mountains. As they moved, the jungle seemed to conspire against them. Muddy trails slowed their progress, and the thick canopy made it impossible to spot enemy snipers. One by one, soldiers fell to unseen attackers. Cao, clutching his rifle tightly, stayed close to Pao. "We're being hunted," he whispered, his voice trembling. Suddenly, an explosion ripped through the column, scattering soldiers. Cao was thrown into a ditch, his ears ringing. When he looked up, he saw Pao, bleeding but alive, shouting orders. The general's presence rallied the troops, who regrouped and counterattacked, driving the enemy back temporarily. As night fell, the battered Hmong force found temporary refuge in a narrow valley. But the question lingered: how long could they evade the enemy? And with a potential traitor among them, who could they trust? The valley was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. The Hmong fighters, exhausted and bloody, took cover among the rocks and thick underbrush. Vang Pao walked the camp's perimeter, checking on his troops. The whispers of betrayal haunted him. Every shadow felt like a threat, every unguarded word a potential revelation. Cao sat alone, staring at the rifle in his lap. His mind replayed the chaotic ambush that had decimated the Ghost Battalion. The enemy had known their exact movements, and the idea that someone in their ranks had betrayed them filled him with dread. Nearby, an older soldier muttered, "We shouldn't trust anyone who made it back alive from that ambush." Cao's stomach churned, and his grip tightened on the weapon. Just before dawn, Pao called his trusted lieutenants for a strategy meeting. Thong, the seasoned tracker, spread a rudimentary map on the ground. "The enemy has us pinned," he said grimly. "They're closing in from both sides. We can't fight them head-on. But there's a cave system nearby. If we can reach it, we might have a chance to regroup." The plan was risky. The cave system was uncharted, and moving through it could trap them if the enemy discovered their location. "We have no choice," Pao decided. "We move at night. No fires, no noise. And if anyone falls behind," he paused, letting the silence speak the grim truth. The Hmong fighters moved like ghosts under the cover of darkness. Every step was calculated, every sound muffled. Cao stayed close to Chang's replacement, a grizzled sergeant named Nai, who had fought in countless skirmishes against the communists. "Keep your eyes on the man in front of you," Nai whispered. "And trust your instincts. The jungle has a way of playing tricks." The tension was unbearable. At one point, a snapping twig sent the column into a frenzy, rifles pointed in all directions. It turned out to be nothing, a terrified civet fleeing their approach. Cao's heart pounded in his chest. As they approached the caves, Thong signaled for a halt. He had spotted something, a faint glimmer in the moonlight. "Tripwire," he hissed, gesturing for the men to stay back. Pao knelt beside him, studying the trap. "They know where we're going," he muttered. Thong carefully disarmed the device, but it was a clear sign: the communists were one step ahead. The traitor was still feeding them information. "We can't stop," Pao said, his voice steel. "Move." When they reached the cave entrance, it was barely visible behind a curtain of vines. The fighters poured inside, their breathing shallow. The cave was dark and cold, the sound of dripping water echoing through the tunnels. It felt like a temporary reprieve, but Pao knew it was only a matter of time before the Pathet Lao found them. Deep within the caves, the Hmong fighters set up a defensive perimeter. Scouts were sent to explore the labyrinthine passages, but the reports were troubling. The caves were a maze, and getting lost was a real danger. "We'll need to ration food and water," Nai warned. "We could be here for days." As the men settled into uneasy silence, paranoia began to spread. Who was the traitor? The question hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Cal noticed the way some of the soldiers looked at him, their eyes filled with suspicion. Even Nai seemed more distant. The tension reached a breaking point when a supply bag was found slashed open, its contents missing. "This isn't the enemy," one soldier growled. "This is someone here." Accusations flew, and tempers flared. Pao stepped in, his voice commanding. "Enough," he barked. "The enemy is out there, not in here. If we turn on each other, we're already dead." But even Pao's words couldn't extinguish the growing distrust. That night, Cal found it impossible to sleep. He kept his rifle close, unsure if he was more afraid of the communists outside or the men beside him. The next day brought disaster. While the scouts were mapping the cave's exits, a sudden explosion rocked the tunnels. The walls shook violently, sending debris raining down. Men shouted in confusion, their voices echoing chaotically. When the dust cleared, Pao realized what had happened. One of the cave entrances had been sealed. Someone had set off explosives to trap them. "It's the traitor," Nai growled. "They're trying to kill us from within." Pao's mind raced. If the communists had the traitor's help, they would soon know which exits to block. They were running out of time. "We need to move now," he ordered. "Thong, find us another way out." As the fighters prepared to evacuate, a chilling discovery was made. One of the scouts was missing. His body was found in a side passage, a knife buried in his back. "He must have seen something," Nai said grimly. Cal felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. Could the traitor be one of the officers? Or someone he had trusted? The thought gnawed at him as the group plunged deeper into the caves, their hope dwindling with each step. Thong led the fighters deeper into the twisting passages, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the jagged walls. The air grew colder, and the sound of water dripping from stalactites was the only noise accompanying their labored breaths. Every step felt like a gamble in the labyrinth of darkness. As they moved, Cal couldn't shake the growing paranoia. He glanced behind him constantly, convinced that someone among them was watching too closely. Nai whispered to him, "Keep your head. Fear will get us killed faster than bullets." Cal nodded, but the knot in his stomach only tightened. Ahead, Thong halted suddenly. "We're close to another exit," he whispered. "I can feel the air shifting." But before they could rejoice, a faint metallic clink echoed through the tunnel. Everyone froze. Mines. The Pathet Lao had anticipated this escape route. Pao acted quickly. "Everyone, stay exactly where you are," he ordered. He gestured to Thong and Nai. "Can you clear the way?" The tracker crouched low, studying the faint glint of tripwires in the dim light. He nodded grimly. "But it will take time." Time was a luxury they didn't have. Behind them, faint voices echoed, Pathet Lao troops were closing in. Pao's heart raced. "Set up an ambush," he said quietly. "If they find us, we'll make them regret it." Cao and a small group of fighters took defensive positions behind natural rock formations. Their rifles were trained on the tunnel's entrance, where the faint glow of flashlights signaled the enemy's approach. Every muscle in Cao's body was taut with tension. The Pathet Lao soldiers moved cautiously, their rifles sweeping the darkness. They knew their quarry was near. Cao's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath shallow. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple. Then, the signal came. Nai fired the first shot, dropping one of the enemy soldiers. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed deafeningly through the cave, the muzzle flashes illuminating the grim battle. Cao squeezed the trigger repeatedly, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. A Pathet Lao soldier fell mere meters away, his lifeless eyes staring into the void. The Hmong fighters' ambush caught the enemy off guard, but the confined space made the fight brutal. Shouts of pain and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. When the enemy began to retreat, Pao ordered his men to hold fire. The silence that followed was heavy with exhaustion and fear. Thong reappeared, his face grim but determined. "The path is clear," he said. "But we need to move now. They'll be back, and they'll bring more with them." The fighters emerged from the cave into the pale light of dawn. The fresh air was a bitter reminder of the relentless pursuit they faced. Thong had led them to a dense jungle valley, but the terrain was treacherous, with steep cliffs and slick mud. "We cross here," Thong said, pointing to a narrow path that wound along the edge of the cliffs. Below, a roaring river churned violently. Pao hesitated. "One misstep, and we're done," he muttered. But there was no other choice. The fighters moved single file, each step precarious. Cao felt his legs tremble as he inched along the narrow ledge. The sound of the river below was deafening, masking the quiet dread of the men. Suddenly, a rock gave way beneath one of the soldiers, sending him plunging into the abyss. His scream was cut short by the roar of the water. The loss shook them, but they pressed on. As they neared the end of the path, Pao spotted movement in the trees above. Pathet Lao snipers. "Ambush," he shouted. Bullets rained down, forcing the fighters to scatter. Cao dove for cover, landing hard on the rocky ground. He returned fire, his aim unsteady but determined. Thong, pinned down nearby, yelled, "We need to draw them out." Pao signaled a flanking maneuver, sending a small team to circle behind the snipers. The tactic worked. The Hmong fighters overwhelmed the snipers, silencing the threat. But the cost was high, several men lay wounded or dead. Cao stared at the lifeless bodies, the weight of the war pressing down on him like never before. The surviving fighters regrouped in a small clearing, their numbers dwindling and their spirits frayed. Pao knew they couldn't sustain this pace much longer. Supplies were critically low, and the men were on the verge of collapse. As they debated their next move, a figure emerged from the jungle. The fighters raised their rifles, but Pao held up a hand. "Wait," he said, his eyes narrowing. The figure was an old Laotian farmer, his hands raised in surrender. "I mean no harm," the man said in a trembling voice. "I heard the gunfire. You're being hunted, aren't you?" Pao nodded cautiously. The farmer introduced himself as Samchai and offered a glimmer of hope. "There's an abandoned village not far from here. It's hidden in the hills. You can rest there, but you'll have to move quickly." The fighters were hesitant. Was this another trap? Cao looked into the man's eyes and saw no malice, only fear. "We have to take the chance," he said. Pao agreed, but he ordered half the group to scout ahead. "If it's a trap," he warned Samchai, "you won't live to see it." The village was real, a cluster of crumbling huts concealed by dense foliage. As the fighters settled in, Somchai revealed something else. "The communists have a supply depot nearby," he said. "If you're desperate, you might find what you need there." Hao's mind raced. The depot could be a lifeline, or a deadly gamble. Either way, he knew one thing: the fight for Ban Padong was far from over. The sun dipped below the horizon as Pao gathered his commanders around a small lantern in the abandoned village. Somkai's information about the nearby Pathet Lao supply depot was their only hope for survival. "If we don't take that depot, we die here," Pao said bluntly. But this could be a trap. Nai, leaning on his rifle, nodded. "It's too convenient. They might be waiting for us." Thong added, "The jungle paths could be rigged with mines or ambush points. If we go, we have to be ghosts, no noise, no mistakes." Pao assigned a small, elite team to infiltrate the depot. Cao volunteered immediately, his desperation to prove himself outweighing his fear. Pao hesitated, studying the young soldier's resolve. "Stick to Nai's side," he said finally. "Do not stray from the plan." Under the cover of darkness, the team slipped into the jungle. Hours of silent trekking brought them to the edge of the depot, a collection of crude huts surrounded by armed guards. Piles of ammunition and supplies were stacked in the center. Cao's heart pounded as he crouched behind a tree, watching the guards' movements. "There are too many," he whispered. "How can we?" Nai cut him off with a sharp gesture. "This isn't about killing everyone," Nai murmured. "We take what we need and disappear before they even know we're here." The operation began smoothly. Nai led the team through the shadows, avoiding the guards' patrol routes. Cao's hands trembled as he helped load sacks of rice and crates of ammunition onto their makeshift carriers. The tension was suffocating, every creak of wood or snap of a twig felt like a gunshot. As they prepared to withdraw, Cao spotted something unusual, a radio operator speaking urgently into a transmitter. "Nai," he whispered, "they're calling for reinforcements." Nai's face darkened. "We're out of time. Move." But as the team retreated, a spotlight flared to life, sweeping across the depot and freezing them in their tracks. "Intruders," a voice bellowed, and gunfire erupted. Cao's ears rang as bullets tore through the air. The Hmong fighters scattered, returning fire as they scrambled for cover. Cao ducked behind a stack of barrels, his heart racing. He watched in horror as one of his comrades fell, clutching a bullet wound. Nai dragged the wounded man to safety, barking orders. "Stick together. Fall back." The team fought their way out, leaving behind most of the supplies. As they disappeared into the jungle, Cao glanced over his shoulder. The depot was now ablaze, the flames illuminating the chaos they had left behind. The escape from the depot was only the beginning. The Pathet Lao forces were relentless, their shouts echoing through the jungle as they pursued the fleeing Hmong fighters. Cao's lungs burned as he ran, the weight of his rifle and gear slowing him down. Nai led the group, his knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. "Keep moving," he shouted over his shoulder. "Don't stop." The jungle seemed alive, its dense foliage both a shield and a trap. Cao tripped over a root, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle, but he bit back a cry. Nai appeared beside him, yanking him to his feet. "You fall, you die," Nai growled. "Now move." Behind them, the sound of gunfire grew closer. The enemy wasn't far. Pao's voice crackled over the radio, giving a grim update. "We're setting up an ambush at the village. Lead them to us. Kao's heart sank. The village was supposed to be their refuge, but now it would become a battlefield. As they neared the village, Nai signaled for the group to spread out. "We'll give them hell before they touch us," he said grimly. Kao nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. The Pathet Lao soldiers stormed into the village just before dawn, their ranks confident and their movements precise. But they weren't prepared for the traps that Pao's men had set. Hidden claymore mines detonated, shredding the vanguard. From the rooftops of crumbling huts, Hmong fighters unleashed a hail of bullets. Kao, perched behind a barricade, fired into the advancing enemy. His aim was steady now, his fear replaced by a burning determination to survive. Nai fought beside him, his voice rising above the chaos. "Don't let them break through." The Pathet Lao regrouped, their superior numbers overwhelming the defenders. Rockets exploded against the huts, reducing them to rubble. Pao called for a tactical retreat, ordering his men to fall back into the jungle. "We can't hold this position," he shouted. Kao hesitated, his heart pounding as he watched Nai cover the retreat. The older soldier stood his ground, his rifle spitting fire. "Go!" Nai roared. "I'll hold them off." Kao's chest tightened, but he obeyed, retreating with the others. As the Hmong fighters melted into the jungle, Kao looked back one last time. The village was engulfed in flames, and Nai's silhouette was barely visible amidst the smoke and chaos. Tears blurred Kao's vision, but he pressed on, knowing the battle was far from over. The Hmong fighters regrouped deep in the jungle, the sound of the battle for the village fading behind them. Exhaustion etched every face, and the weight of their losses pressed heavily on the group. Kao sat on a fallen log, his hands trembling as he stared at the dirt. The memory of Nai's final stand burned in his mind. Pao moved among his men, his expression grim. "We're not finished yet," he said firmly. "The Pathet Lao will keep hunting us. We have to keep moving." His words were met with tired nods, but morale was crumbling. They were running out of options, and every step deeper into the jungle felt like a step closer to doom. Thong approached Pao, his voice low. "The men are losing faith. They're whispering about the traitor again. If we don't deal with this, it'll tear us apart." Pao's jaw tightened. He knew Thong was right. The betrayal had already cost them dearly, and the suspicion was a poison spreading through the ranks. That night, as the men rested in small groups, Pao made a decision. He called for a quiet meeting of his most trusted fighters, including Kao. "We need to root out the traitor before it's too late," Pao said. "But we do this carefully. No false accusations, no chaos. We'll watch everyone, and when they slip, we'll act." The next morning, the group moved again, following Thong's lead through the dense jungle. The trees loomed overhead, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was damp and suffocating, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Kao stayed close to Pao, his eyes scanning the jungle for any signs of danger. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the Pathet Lao, but by someone within their own ranks. As the group approached a narrow ravine, Thong suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. "Something's wrong," he whispered. He pointed to the ground, where fresh footprints veered off the trail. "Someone's gone ahead." Pao's eyes narrowed. "Split into pairs and fan out. Find whoever it is." Kao and another young fighter, Mai, moved cautiously along the side path, their rifles at the ready. Every step was deliberate, every sound a potential threat. Suddenly, they heard a faint metallic clink. Cal froze, his eyes locking onto a tripwire stretched across the path. He signaled to Mai, who carefully disarmed it. "This isn't just the enemy," Cal whispered. "Someone is setting us up." The realization hit too late. As Cal and Mike turned back, a flurry of gunfire erupted from the jungle. The path at Lao had been lying in wait. Bullets tore through the foliage, forcing the Hmong fighters to dive for cover. Cal's heart raced as he returned fire, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the enemy positions. "We're pinned," Mai shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Cal glanced around, searching for an escape route. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, a familiar voice rang out, "House." The general and his group had flanked the ambushers, catching them off guard. The jungle erupted into chaos as the Hmong fighters unleashed their counterattack. The path at Lao, realizing they were outmaneuvered, began to retreat. Pao didn't allow his men to pursue. "Save your bullets," he ordered. "We'll need them for what's coming." As the group regrouped, Pao noticed something disturbing. One of their men was missing. The realization sent a chill down his spine. "The traitor was here," he muttered. "They're leading the enemy straight to us." The next 2 days were a nightmare of constant movement. The path at Lao were relentless, their pursuit tightening like a noose. The Hmong fighters barely had time to eat or rest, their exhaustion growing with each passing hour. Thon brought grim news during a brief stop. "They're tracking us too easily. It's not just the traitor. They're using scouts and radio coordination." Pao nodded, his face drawn. "Then we'll turn their strength into a weakness." Pao devised a plan to ambush the path at Lao's forward scouts and steal their radios. It was a risky move, but it was their only chance to disrupt the enemy's coordination. Cal volunteered for the mission, his determination unshaken despite his fear. The ambush was quick and brutal. Hmong fighters lay in wait along a narrow jungle path, striking with precision when the scouts arrived. Cal fired his rifle with cold efficiency, the adrenaline drowning out his hesitation. When the skirmish ended, the Hmong had captured 2 radios and eliminated the enemy team. As they retreated with their spoils, Cal felt a glimmer of hope. But it was short-lived. The captured radios revealed chilling transmissions. The path at Lao were preparing for a final assault on their position. Pao gathered his men in a clearing, the captured radios crackling with enemy chatter. The path at Lao were closing in, and there was nowhere left to run. "This is it," Pao said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We make our stand here." The fighters worked tirelessly, setting up makeshift defenses and preparing for the battle ahead. Traps were laid, ammunition was rationed, and every man prepared himself for what could be his last fight. As night fell, the jungle came alive with the sound of approaching enemy forces. Pao stood at the center of the camp, his rifle in hand. "We've fought too hard to give up now," he said. "Remember what we're fighting for. For our people. For our freedom." The path at Lao attack came in waves, each more ferocious than the last. The Hmong defenders held their ground, their resolve unbroken despite the overwhelming odds. Cal fought alongside Pao, his fear replaced by a fierce determination. By dawn, the jungle was silent again. The path at Lao had retreated, their losses too great to continue the assault. But the victory was bittersweet. The Hmong fighters had paid a heavy price, and the battle for Ban Pa Dong had come to a devastating end. The Battle of Nha Khang. The sound of mortar fire shattered the pre-dawn silence, reverberating across the hills of northern Laos. The strategic outpost of Nha Khang, a remote airstrip nestled in rugged terrain, was under siege. It was February 16, 1966, and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, launched a ferocious assault, aiming to wrest control of the base from the Royal Lao Army and their American advisors. Colonel Vang Pao, the legendary Hmong commander, stood resolute amidst the chaos. His sharp eyes scanned the flickering light of explosions in the distance as he barked orders to his outnumbered troops. "Hold the perimeter. Reinforcements will come." His words were more of a hope than a certainty. The enemy had been amassing for weeks, their presence betrayed only by faint trails of smoke rising from the jungle canopy. Now, the assault had begun with full force. In the makeshift command bunker, Captain Charles Larimore Jones, an American forward air controller, FAC, radioed frantic coordinates to overhead aircraft. "We need fire support on the western ridge. They're massing there." His voice cracked with tension. Above him, the familiar drone of an AC-47 Spooky gunship circled, unleashing streams of red tracer fire into the jungle below. Each burst temporarily illuminated the shadowy figures of advancing enemy troops. Suddenly, the line broke. A section of the Royal Lao forces faltered under the relentless pressure of the NVA. With a roar, the enemy surged forward, only to be met by a desperate counterattack from Vang Pao's elite auto-defense Chok militia. The fight turned savage, with close-quarter combat erupting under the thin glow of flares. Despite the carnage, one truth became clear: Nha Khang was teetering on the brink of collapse. Months before the first battle, whispers of betrayal had spread through the Royal Lao Army ranks. General Kong Lee's forces' arms neutralists, Phan, once an ally, had shown signs of collusion with the North Vietnamese. The stakes at Nha Khang were high, not just for Laos but for the CIA's secret war in Southeast Asia. Losing the base would mean handing the enemy a critical foothold and exposing the clandestine American operations to global scrutiny. In the months leading to the siege, Major Ramon Horonet, a seasoned CIA operative, had infiltrated the Phan's leadership. In the dim confines of a remote meeting hall, he confronted a key officer suspected of treachery. "We know you've been talking to Hanoi," Horonek said coldly, his revolver resting on the table. The officer, a wiry man with a scar stretching across his face, smirked but said nothing. The silence was deafening, filled with the weight of unspoken truths. Meanwhile, in Nha Khang, preparations were underway to bolster defenses. Air America pilots risked everything to airlift supplies and reinforcements to the isolated base. One of these pilots, a brash but skilled flyer named John D. Haney, recalled the eerie silence of the jungle as his plane approached. "You could feel it," he later said. The enemy was there, just waiting for the right moment to strike. As tensions rose, Vang Pao found himself questioning the loyalty of his allies. Could he trust Phan forces stationed nearby, or would they turn on him when the battle reached its peak? He decided to take no chances, ordering his men to fortify key positions and stockpile ammunition for what he knew would be a brutal confrontation. The sun had barely risen when the first signs of betrayal emerged. A small unit of Phan soldiers stationed near the airstrip abruptly withdrew, leaving a vulnerable gap in the defenses. Captain Jones, monitoring the situation from his observation post, noticed the movement through his binoculars. "They're pulling out," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. Before he could act, a mortar shell exploded nearby, sending debris flying. Jones hit the ground, his ears ringing. As he staggered to his feet, he radioed Vang Pao. "We've got a problem, Phan's pulling out. They're leaving us exposed." Vang Pao's response was curt but resolute. "We fight without them. Rally the men." With that, the Hmong leader prepared his militia for the inevitable onslaught. It was no longer a battle for territory, it was a battle for survival. At dusk, the NVA launched their first major assault. Waves of soldiers surged forward, their battle cries piercing the air. Despite their exhaustion, the defenders of Nok Hang fought with a ferocity born of desperation. But as the hours dragged on, the cost became apparent. The defenders were running low on ammunition, and the promised reinforcements were nowhere in sight. Nightfall brought with it an eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant echoes of jungle creatures and a faint, deliberate rustling of enemy movement. Captain Jones sat hunched over his radio, sweat trickling down his temple. Somewhere in the darkness, the enemy was regrouping, preparing for the next wave. Above, the AC-47 spooky gunship began its menacing orbit again. Red tracers lit up the jungle, but something felt wrong. Reports from the forward scouts painted a grim picture. Enemy units had begun using the dense terrain to bypass the defenses entirely. Jones's hand hovered over his map, the realization sinking in. "They're circling us," he muttered. Meanwhile, Vang Pao gathered his commanders in the command bunker. The dim glow of a single lantern revealed their grim faces. "The jungle is alive with their movement," he said. "They're not charging this time, they're hunting." The men nodded, their eyes betraying fear and resolve. As the night wore on, small skirmishes broke out in the perimeter. The NVA tested the defenders' nerves, probing for weaknesses. At one picket post, a young Hmong soldier, barely old enough to hold his rifle, spotted a shadow moving through the trees. He fired, the crack of his weapon shattering the stillness. His comrades rushed to his side, only to find no enemy, just the shifting shadows of an impenetrable jungle. Desperation grew in the early hours of the morning as supplies dwindled. Vang Pao called for an emergency resupply, knowing the odds were against him. Air America pilots had faced harrowing conditions before, but this mission would be suicidal, flying into a besieged outpost under enemy fire. John D. Haney received the call at Long Tieng. The grizzled pilot glanced at the darkened sky, his cigarette glowing faintly in the gloom. "We're their last shot," he said to his co-pilot. "If we don't go, they're done for." Against all reason, they loaded the plane with crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and rations, preparing for the treacherous flight. As the C-123 provider approached Nok Hang, anti-aircraft fire lit up the night. Haney gripped the controls tightly, banking sharply to avoid a sudden burst. The base below was a maelstrom of chaos. Flashes of gunfire and exploding mortars illuminated the airstrip, a hellish beacon in the jungle. The plane touched down hard, skidding on the uneven dirt. Ground crew rushed to unload the supplies, but the clock was ticking. A mortar round landed dangerously close, sending shrapnel into the side of the fuselage. "We're out of here," Haney shouted, throttling the engines for takeoff. As the plane clawed its way back into the sky, a second round exploded just behind it, sending a fiery plume into the night. At dawn, the unthinkable happened. A fan officer, supposedly an ally, approached the Nok Hang defenders with an offer to negotiate a ceasefire with the NVA. Vang Pao's instincts screamed at him to refuse, but he needed time to regroup. Against his better judgment, he agreed to a temporary ceasefire, ordering his men to hold their positions but stay vigilant. Hours later, the negotiation proved to be a ruse. The fan forces not only failed to return but handed over intelligence about Nok Hang's defenses to the enemy. The NVA's artillery began pounding the base with newfound precision, targeting command posts and supply caches with deadly accuracy. Captain Jones, crouched in his observation post, watched in horror as one of the picket lines was obliterated. "They've sold us out," he shouted into his radio, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of explosions. Vang Pao's rage was volcanic. "Pull back to the inner perimeter," he ordered. The Hmong fighters retreated to a hastily constructed defensive line, their resolve hardening despite the betrayal. For every inch the NBA gained, they paid dearly in blood, but the defenders knew they couldn't hold forever. By the third day, rumors spread like wildfire through the defenders' ranks. Some claimed to have seen shadowy figures, neither enemy nor ally, slipping through the jungle at night. Others whispered of ghostly voices calling their names, leading soldiers into the jungle, never to return. In the chaos, a young medic named Lee, barely 20, struggled to keep the wounded alive. The makeshift field hospital was a scene of misery, blood-soaked bandages, muffled cries of pain, and the acrid stench of burning flesh from cauterized wounds. Lee worked tirelessly, her hands trembling as she stitched a soldier's torn abdomen. "You'll make it," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Meanwhile, Captain Jones tried to rally what remained of the air support. "We need more bombers on the eastern ridge," he radioed, his voice hoarse. But the response from headquarters was bleak. "We've got nothing to spare. You're on your own for now." In the jungle, the NBA prepared for the final push. Their officers, emboldened by the betrayal and their incremental gains, planned a coordinated assault to break the defenders' last line. For the men and women of Nakhang, the coming hours would decide their fate. The jungle seemed alive as the sun dipped below the horizon. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves carried the weight of menace. The defenders of Nakhang, battered and exhausted, clung to their positions, their nerves fraying with each passing hour. Among them was Som Chai, a Thai volunteer fighter who had joined the effort through a covert agreement with his government. As darkness settled, he swore he saw movement, ghostly shapes weaving between the trees. Som Chai, eyes forward, barked his commander, but the warning came too late. A sniper's bullet found its mark, grazing Som Chai's helmet and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The shot was a signal, and moments later, the NBA began their assault. Mortars rained down, and the jungle erupted in chaos. Meanwhile, Captain Jones was high above the fray in a single-engine one-bird dog, directing airstrikes. But the NBA had adapted, employing new tactics to avoid detection. Using thick foliage as cover, they advanced in small, disciplined units. Jones knew they were coming for the airstrip, and if it fell, the battle was lost. "Spooky, I need you on the south perimeter now," he shouted into his radio. The AC-47 answered with a roar, its minigun spitting death into the jungle. But even the infamous Huck the Magic Dragon couldn't stem the tide. As the NBA inched closer, their strategy became clear. They were preparing for a coordinated assault under the cover of darkness. Inside the command bunker, tensions reached a boiling point. Vang Pao had received troubling intelligence. A second faction of Fan soldiers, stationed just miles away, had withdrawn without orders. Worse, there were reports that some of his own men were questioning the wisdom of holding Nakhang at all. "You think this is hopeless?" Vang Pao demanded, his voice icy. The accused, a senior officer named Fumi, hesitated, then nodded. "Our allies have abandoned us. The Americans won't commit more forces. Maybe it's time to fall back while we can." The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Vang Pao slammed his fist onto the table. "This is our land. We don't retreat. We fight, or we die trying." The officers exchanged wary glances, but none dared to challenge him further. Unbeknownst to them, an NBA operative embedded within the Fan faction had intercepted Bang Pao's radio transmissions. Armed with detailed knowledge of the defenders' positions and weaknesses, the NBA commander planned to exploit the growing fractures within the Royal Lao Army. The NBA struck just before midnight, launching a multi-pronged assault designed to overwhelm the defenders. On the western flank, the auto-defense Chok militia fought valiantly but was forced to retreat under the relentless pressure. At the airstrip, Somchai and his Thai comrades held their ground against wave after wave of attackers, their machine guns blazing until the barrels glowed red. In the chaos, a small team of Hmong fighters led by a grizzled veteran named Chai made a daring counterattack. Armed with nothing but grenades and their sheer determination, they infiltrated the enemy's forward position. Chai's last words to his team were simple: "We don't come back unless we win." Meanwhile, Captain Jones faced his own crisis in the sky. His bird dog was struck by enemy fire, and he was forced to make an emergency landing near the eastern perimeter. Crawling from the wreckage, he found himself behind enemy lines, the sounds of battle ringing all around him. Clutching his sidearm, he began the harrowing journey back to friendly territory, every step fraught with danger. By dawn, the defenders had managed to hold the airstrip, but at a terrible cost. The bodies of fallen comrades littered the ground, and the jungle stank of smoke and blood. Among the survivors was Somchai, his face streaked with grime but his spirit unbroken. "We're still here," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But for how long? As the battered defenders regrouped, whispers of an impending betrayal reached Bang Pao's ears. A captured NBA soldier, barely more than a boy, had revealed under interrogation that a high-ranking Fan officer was coordinating with the enemy. The revelation sent shockwaves through the camp. "Who is it?" Bang Pao demanded, but the boy could only shake his head. "He is here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "But I do not know his name." The implications were chilling. The traitor was among them, feeding the enemy critical information. Captain Jones, now back with the defenders after his near-death escape, joined Bang Pao in hunting the mole. Their investigation led them to a small hut on the edge of the camp, where they discovered a hidden radio transmitter tuned to an NBA frequency. The operator was gone, leaving only a chilling message scrawled on a scrap of paper: "Nok Hang falls tonight." The cryptic warning found in the abandoned hut sent shockwaves through the defenders. "Nok Hang falls tonight." The words felt like a death sentence, a grim prophecy that loomed over every soldier and officer in the camp. Bang Pao paced the command bunker, his mind racing. "The traitor is here," he muttered, his voice laced with fury. "We must find him before it's too late." Captain Jones stood nearby, scanning a list of personnel. "Whoever it is, they're not working alone. That kind of coordination requires planning and resources," he said grimly. As the search for the mole intensified, suspicion fell on a quiet logistics officer named Kamsing. He had been seen lingering near the abandoned hut the night before. When confronted, Kamsing protested his innocence, his voice trembling. "I was checking supplies. I swear I had nothing to do with this." But the evidence was damning. A notebook filled with coded messages was discovered in his quarters. Under pressure, Kamsing finally broke. "It wasn't me," he cried. "I only delivered the messages. The real traitor is higher up." His confession sent ripples of paranoia through the ranks. If the mole was someone with authority, no one could be trusted. Kamsing's accusation hung heavy in the air as Bang Pao and Captain Jones interrogated their officers. Each denial felt rehearsed, every alibi suspect. Tensions boiled over when Lieutenant Fumi, the officer who had earlier suggested retreat, was caught trying to leave the camp under cover of darkness. Dragged into the bunker, Fumi glared at Bang Pao. "You've already lost," he said coldly. "The NVA will crush this outpost, with or without my help." His words were a bitter confirmation of their worst fears. Fumi revealed that he had been feeding the NVA information for months, believing that surrendering to their superior forces was the only way to save Laos from total destruction. "Your stubbornness will get us all killed," he spat at Bang Pao. Bang Pao's response was swift. "Take him outside," he ordered. The soldiers hesitated, but the look in their commander's eyes left no room for argument. As the traitor was dragged away, the mood in the camp shifted. The remaining officers knew what awaited them if they faltered in their loyalty. For a brief moment, Nakang fell silent. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, as though the land itself was bracing for the final act of the battle. Supplies were critically low, and reinforcements from the Royal Lao Army had failed to materialize. Captain Jones spent the day coordinating air support. The few planes still operational had been patched together with sheer determination. "We'll give them hell," he said to his radio operator, though he knew the odds were grim. Meanwhile, Somchai and his Thai comrades fortified the airstrip, their faces set with grim determination. They had become brothers in this fight, bound by shared blood and sweat. Somchai passed a cigarette to his closest friend, Varun, who took a long drag before speaking. "You think we'll see tomorrow?" Arun asked. Somchai glanced at the darkening sky. "If we don't, at least we'll make them remember today." As night fell, the NVA launched their most devastating assault yet. The sound of artillery and mortar fire was deafening, a relentless drumbeat that shook the very ground. Waves of enemy soldiers surged forward, their silhouettes illuminated by the eerie glow of flares. Bang Pao stood at the front line, rallying his troops with a defiance that seemed almost superhuman. "Hold the line," he roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. His Hmong fighters responded with a ferocity born of desperation, their rifles cracking in unison. At the airstrip, Somchai and Arun manned a machine gun nest, mowing down enemy after enemy. The barrel of their weapon glowed red-hot, but they refused to stop. When the ammunition ran out, they switched to grenades, hurling them into the advancing horde. Above, Captain Jones directed the last AC-47 gunship over the battlefield. "Hit the eastern flank," he shouted into his radio. The gunship's miniguns roared to life, carving a deadly path through the NVA ranks. But the victory was short-lived. A surface-to-air missile streaked upward, striking the aircraft and sending it spiraling into the jungle. The loss of the AC-47 was a devastating blow. The wreckage burned in the distance, a grim reminder of how thin the defenders' lifeline had become. Captain Jones watched from his observation post, his fists clenched in helpless rage. Despite the setback, the defenders refused to yield. Somchai, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, fought with a fury that inspired those around him. When a grenade landed near their position, Arun threw himself onto it, sacrificing his life to save his friend. The explosion threw Somchai backward, his ears ringing. When he regained his senses, he found himself clutching Arun's lifeless body. Gritting his teeth, he stood and returned to the fight, his every action a tribute to his fallen comrade. As dawn approached, the NVA began to pull back, their losses too heavy to continue the assault. For the defenders of Nakang, it was a bittersweet victory. They had survived another night, but the cost had been immense. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the thick jungle canopy, the battlefield revealed its grisly truths. Bodies lay scattered across the landscape, friend and foe alike. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic stench of blood. Vang Pao walked among the survivors, his face a mask of exhaustion. The night's victory had come at a terrible cost. Somchai sat slumped against a sandbag, his hands still trembling as he replayed Arun's sacrifice in his mind. Around him, the survivors began the grim task of clearing the dead and tending to the wounded. Captain Jones surveyed the scene from what remained of his observation post. He knew the reprieve was temporary. "They'll come again," he muttered, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "They always do." But something about the NBA retreat felt off, too sudden, too incomplete. Hours later, an injured scout stumbled into the camp with shocking news. The NBA weren't retreating, they were regrouping. Worse, a massive supply convoy had been spotted moving toward their position. The enemy was preparing for a final, all-out assault. Determined to disrupt the NBA's plans, Vang Pao devised a daring countermeasure. The Royal Lao Army's few remaining artillery pieces were repositioned to target the convoy. At the same time, Captain Jones worked with the remaining air assets to organize a precision strike. But as the operation unfolded, a chilling discovery was made. The convoy was a decoy. Hidden in the jungle, the real force was already advancing toward Nok Hang. "They played us," Jones growled, slamming his fist against the table in frustration. The enemy's ploy created chaos among the defenders. Vang Pao scrambled to reposition his forces, ordering his men to prepare for an attack from an unexpected direction. Meanwhile, the NBA used the confusion to infiltrate the jungle around the base, their snipers picking off defenders one by one. Despite the chaos, a glimmer of hope emerged. An intercepted enemy radio transmission revealed the exact timing of the NBA's final assault. Armed with this knowledge, Vang Pao and Jones began planning a desperate ambush, one that could turn the tide of the battle. As the jungle stirred with the first light of day, the defenders of Nok Hang lay in wait. Vang Pao's militia had dug in along a narrow valley where the NBA was expected to advance. Hidden among the dense foliage, they prepared their weapons in silence, their faces set with grim determination. Somchai, now a seasoned fighter, took position on a ridge overlooking the valley. Beside him was Lee, the young medic who had traded her medical bag for a rifle. "You ever fire one of those?" Somchai asked, gesturing to her weapon. "Not until today," Lee replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The NDA advanced as expected, their disciplined ranks moving with eerie precision. When the first wave entered the valley, Vang Pao gave the signal. A hail of gunfire and grenades erupted from the jungle, catching the enemy off guard. The ambush was devastating, but the NBA's sheer numbers allowed them to regroup quickly. A brutal firefight ensued, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The defenders fought fiercely, but as the hours wore on, their exhaustion began to show. Vang Pao knew they couldn't hold the valley much longer. "Pull back to the airstrip," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The defenders retreated to the airstrip, their last line of defense. Supplies were nearly gone, and ammunition was dangerously low. The realization that this could be their final stand hung heavy over the camp. Captain Jones, now grounded after the loss of his bird dog, joined the defenders at the airstrip. He carried a rifle instead of a radio, his resolve as steely as the soldiers around him. "We make this count," he said, his voice firm. "Every minute we hold buys time for reinforcements." The NBA came like a tidal wave, their forces bolstered by the hidden reserves that had eluded the ambush. Mortars rained down on the airstrip, turning it into a hellscape of fire and shrapnel. Somchai fought on the front lines, his rifle never ceasing. Beside him, Lee provided cover, her newfound skill with a rifle saving countless lives. As the NBA closed in, Vang Pao made a fateful decision. He ordered his remaining forces to fall back to a series of bunkers near the edge of the airstrip, leaving the central area as a kill zone. The move bought them precious time, but it also left them with no room to retreat. As the defenders prepared for what seemed like certain death, a distant sound reached their ears, the unmistakable roar of jet engines. Vang Pao's gamble had paid off. Reinforcements from the Royal Lao Air Force and the U.S. 602nd Air Commando Squadron were inbound. The first wave of airstrikes hit the NBA positions with devastating precision. One Skyraider swooped low, dropping napalm and cluster munitions. The jungle erupted into flames, forcing the NBA to scatter. The defenders cheered as the enemy's advance faltered, but the celebration was short-lived. A lucky anti-aircraft round struck one of the Skyraiders, sending it spiraling into the jungle. The crash ignited a new firestorm, one that threatened to engulf the defenders' bunkers. Vang Pao and his men fought to contain the blaze while continuing to repel the NBA. The chaos of fire and smoke created an almost apocalyptic scene, but amid the destruction, the defenders found a renewed sense of hope. They had survived another day, and with the reinforcements now arriving, Nha Khang might just hold. The airstrip at Nha Khang was a scene of utter devastation, but the arrival of reinforcements brought a glimmer of hope to the beleaguered defenders. The Royal Lao Air Force's A-1 Skyraiders and U.S. air support continued to pound the NBA positions relentlessly. The enemy, disoriented and bleeding from the fierce ambush and counterattacks, appeared to pause their advance. Vang Pao capitalized on this brief reprieve. "Rearm and regroup," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. He personally oversaw the distribution of the newly arrived supplies, ensuring that every fighter was ready for the inevitable next assault. Sam Chai, now an unofficial leader among his comrades, helped fortify the eastern perimeter, where the enemy was most likely to attack. Lee worked tirelessly in the medical tent, her hands a blur as she stitched wounds and administered what little morphine was left. "We need to hold," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. In the command bunker, Captain Jones reviewed aerial reconnaissance photos delivered by the U.S. pilots. The images revealed a chilling sight. NBA forces were still massing in the jungle, their numbers far greater than initially estimated. "They're not retreating," Jones said grimly. "They're regrouping for a final push." The NBA launched their final assault under the cover of darkness. This time, they came with everything they had: artillery, tanks, and wave after wave of infantry. The jungle lit up with the muzzle flashes of automatic weapons, the explosions of mortar rounds, and the blinding glare of flares that turned night into day. The defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Vang Pao himself manned a machine gun, cutting down enemy soldiers as they charged the airstrip. Sam Chai and his team held the eastern perimeter, their positions battered but unbroken. Each grenade they threw, each shot they fired, carried the weight of their survival. Captain Jones coordinated airstrikes from a forward position, his voice hoarse from shouting into the radio. "Target the tanks on the northern ridge," he commanded. Moments later, a flight of F-105 Thunder Chiefs screamed overhead, their bombs obliterating the advancing armor. Despite their losses, the NBA pressed on. By dawn, they had breached the outer defenses and were pushing toward the command bunker. It was here, in the heart of the base, that the final stand would take place. The airstrip was no longer a battleground, it was a graveyard. Smoke and fire obscured the rising sun as the defenders retreated to their last line of bunkers. Vang Pao, battered but unyielding, rallied his men for one final effort. "This is it," he told them. We hold here, or we die. Lee, armed with a rifle and her dwindling medical supplies, took a position alongside Somchai. If this is the end, I'm glad it's with you, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. The NBA came in waves, their determination unbroken despite their heavy losses. The defenders fought like demons, their every action a testament to their will to survive. When ammunition ran low, they resorted to hand-to-hand combat, using bayonets, knives, and even rocks to repel the enemy. Suddenly, a distant rumble cut through the din of battle. Reinforcements had arrived, not just air support, but a ground column of Royal Lao troops and Thai volunteers. The tide of the battle shifted as the fresh forces hit the NBA from behind, their surprise attack breaking the enemy's resolve. As the sun reached its zenith, the NBA began to withdraw. Their retreat was not one of panic but a calculated maneuver to preserve their remaining forces. The defenders of Nakhang, battered and exhausted, watched in disbelief as the enemy melted back into the jungle. Vang Pao stood atop a sandbag, surveying the battlefield. We did it, he murmured, though the victory felt hollow. The cost had been unimaginable, hundreds of lives lost, the airstrip reduced to rubble. But against all odds, Nakhang had held. For Captain Jones, the relief was bittersweet. He knew the NBA would regroup and return, as they always did. The battle for Nakhang was a victory, but the war was far from over. We bought time, he said quietly. Let's hope it's enough. Somchai and Lee sat together on the edge of the airstrip, their faces streaked with grime and tears. They had survived, but the weight of their losses was unbearable. What now? Lee asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now we rebuild, Somchai replied. And we wait for the next fight. The battles of Nakhang marked a turning point in the Laotian Civil War. Although the defenders achieved a hard-fought victory, the strategic outpost would change hands several more times before the war's end. Each battle took a devastating toll, not only on the soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire but also on the region itself. For Vang Pao and his Hmong fighters, Nakhang became a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. For the Americans, it was a stark reminder of the complexities of a shadow war fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The war continued, as wars often do, leaving scars that would last for generations. But for those who fought and died at Nakhang, their courage and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds became a legacy etched into history. The Battle of Lima Site 85. The silence was deceptive. It was the kind of silence that weighed heavy, the kind that announced itself as a prelude to chaos. Nestled atop the 5,600-foot peak of Phao Pha Thi in northern Laos, Lima Site 85 was no ordinary outpost. Shrouded in secrecy, it housed sophisticated radar equipment capable of guiding U.S bombers in the dark. Officially, it didn't exist. Yet, for the 19 American Air Force technicians and their Hmong and Thai allies stationed there, it was their lifeline. Sergeant Clarence Blanton stood at the edge of the ridge, scanning the dense jungle below with practiced eyes. The verdant foliage stretched endlessly, concealing a deadly truth: the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was closing in. Reports had trickled in over the past weeks, sightings of NVA patrols, intercepted communications, but command seemed reluctant to acknowledge the growing threat. Phao Pha Thi, they believed, was untouchable, its cliffs too steep for a frontal assault. Blanton wasn't so sure. The sound of distant artillery broke the quiet, a low rumble that sent vibrations through the air. Blanton turned to see Lieutenant Richard Secord approaching, his expression grim. Secord, the CIA operative overseeing covert operations in the region, was a man who rarely betrayed emotion. Today, however, even his steely demeanor showed cracks. "They're testing us," Secord muttered. "Probable probing fire from the valley." Blanton nodded, his unease growing. Probing fire meant the enemy was closer than they thought. The jungle, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. "What's the plan, sir?" he asked. "We hold," Secord replied. "Evacuation isn't an option. This site is critical to the air war over North Vietnam. Without it, our bombers lose their edge." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the mountains, the men prepared for what they feared was inevitable. The night brought a chorus of insects and the ever-present hum of the radar systems. Blanton couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Somewhere out there, concealed by the impenetrable jungle, an enemy waiting. And when they struck, it would be swift and merciless. The next morning broke with a haze hanging low over the mountains. Vang Pao, the charismatic Hmong commander who had been coordinating guerrilla resistance against the Pathet Lao and NBA, arrived at the site. His face, weathered by years of combat, bore a mixture of determination and concern. He brought news. Villagers in the valley had reported increased enemy movement. The NBA was massing forces. "You must leave," Vang Pao urged. "They come with numbers too great to stop. Even my men cannot hold them back forever." Secord shook his head. "We can't abandon this position. Washington is clear, this radar must stay operational." The tension in the air was palpable. Blanton, standing nearby, felt a pang of frustration. The Americans were playing a dangerous game, gambling lives for an outpost they believed was invulnerable. He caught the glance of a young radar operator, barely out of training, whose face betrayed the same unease he felt. Later that evening, the enemy made their intentions clear. Mortar rounds exploded around the base, shaking the ground and sending showers of dirt and debris into the air. The defenders scrambled to defensive positions as Secord barked orders. The first salvo ended as quickly as it began, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Blanton gripped his rifle tightly, peering into the darkness. He imagined the NBA soldiers moving through the jungle, disciplined and silent, closing the noose around the mountain. He thought of his family back home, wondering if he'd ever see them again. "Do you think they'll come tonight?" the young operator asked, his voice trembling. "They'll come," Blanton said grimly. "It's just a matter of when." Unbeknownst to the defenders, the NBA had a trump card, a group of Pathet Lao operatives who had been living among the locals, gathering intelligence. These operatives had detailed maps of the base, including its vulnerabilities. As the Americans fortified their positions, the enemy moved closer, confident in their knowledge of the terrain. That night, under the cover of darkness, the NBA launched a daring maneuver. Using ropes and makeshift ladders, they scaled the sheer cliffs on the western side of the mountain, a route the Americans believed impassable. It was a bold and risky move, but one that could turn the tide of battle. Blanton was the first to hear the faint sounds, rustling leaves, the clinking of metal. He raised his hand to signal silence and strained his ears. Then he saw them, shadows moving against the dim light of the moon. He fired a warning shot, and all hell broke loose. The firefight was intense. Bullets ripped through the air, punctuated by the deafening roar of mortars. The defenders fought valiantly, but the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. Blanton found himself cornered with a small group of men, desperately holding the line. The young radar operator was among them, his face pale but resolute. "We're not getting out of this," the operator whispered. "Not if we give up," Blanton snapped. "Keep firing. We hold the line." As dawn broke over the mountains, the battle showed no signs of abating. Lima Site 85, once a symbol of strength, was now a fortress under siege. The men braced themselves for the inevitable, knowing that survival was no longer guaranteed. The enemy was relentless, their determination matched only by the defenders' will to fight. But in war, will alone was not always enough. The morning brought no reprieve. Smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the acrid stench of gunpowder. The defenders had managed to repel the initial wave, but at a staggering cost. Bodies littered the western slope where the enemy had scaled the cliffs, a grim testament to their desperation. Blanton, his face streaked with grime, leaned against a sandbag wall as Secord approached. The CIA operative's usually unshakable composure was beginning to crack. "They'll hit us again," Secord said flatly. "We've bought time, nothing more." Blanton gestured toward the smoking jungle below. "They're testing us. They know our defenses now. The next attack will be the real one." As if on cue, the radio crackled to life. An airman's voice, barely audible over the static, came through. "Recon birds confirm large troop movements southeast of the site. Estimate, 3,000 strong." Secord swore under his breath. The numbers confirmed Vang Pao's earlier warning. This wasn't just a raid, it was an operation. Blanton felt a cold dread settle in his gut. They were vastly outnumbered, and reinforcements were hours away, if they came at all. The defenders braced for the next assault, but as night fell, the jungle remained eerily silent. The hours dragged on, every rustle of leaves or distant crack of a branch setting nerves on edge. Blanton began to wonder if the enemy was toying with them, using fear as a weapon. Then, just before dawn, the first mortar shells began to fall. The NVA attack came in waves, each more ferocious than the last. This time, they brought everything to bear: mortars, machine guns, and disciplined infantry formations. The jungle erupted into chaos as the defenders scrambled to hold their ground. Blanton and a group of Hmong fighters manned a machine gun nest near the northern edge of the site. They fired relentlessly, cutting down enemy soldiers as they charged through the undergrowth. But for every attacker they stopped, two more seemed to take their place. "We're running low on ammo," a Hmong fighter shouted over the din. Blanton glanced at the dwindling supply of belts. "Make every shot count," he yelled back. But even as he spoke, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The sheer volume of enemy fire was overwhelming. Elsewhere on the ridge, Secord coordinated air support. Flares lit up the sky as UAS planes roared overhead, dropping bombs that shook the ground. For a moment, it seemed like the tide might turn. But then the NVA launched a diversionary attack on the southern flank, forcing the defenders to split their focus. In the chaos, Blanton noticed something strange. The enemy wasn't just attacking, they were searching. Groups of soldiers moved purposefully, as if hunting for a specific target. Blanton's heart sank as he realized the truth: they were after the radar equipment. The radar room, the heart of Lima Site 85's mission, was a small, fortified structure perched near the summit. Inside, technicians worked frantically to keep the system operational, guiding bombers through the chaos below. But the NVA was closing in. Secord radioed for evacuation, his voice tight with urgency. "We need those technicians out of here, now." The response from command was maddeningly vague. "Evacuation is being coordinated. Stand by." Stand by. Secord hissed, slamming the radio down. Time was running out, and Washington was playing politics. He turned to Blanton, who had just arrived, bloodied but unbroken. We can't wait. We have to hold until they get here. Blanton nodded grimly. We'll buy them as much time as we can. He rallied a group of volunteers, Hmong fighters, Thai soldiers, and a handful of Americans, and set up a defensive perimeter around the radar building. They fought with everything they had, but the enemy kept coming. Blanton caught a glimpse of a young Hmong boy, no older than 16, firing a rifle with grim determination. The sight filled him with both pride and sorrow. Amid the chaos, a sudden explosion rocked the radar room. Blanton turned in horror to see smoke pouring from the structure. The NBA had breached the defenses. The technicians inside scrambled to destroy the equipment, smashing sensitive components and setting fires to prevent the enemy from capturing the technology. Blanton's radio crackled. This is it, Secord's voice came through. They're inside the wire. Evac helicopters are en route, but they'll be cutting it close. With the radar compromised and the enemy inside the perimeter, the situation was dire. The defenders fell back to the landing zone, a small clearing near the peak where the evacuation helicopters were expected. Every step was contested, every inch of ground paid for in blood. Blanton and Secord coordinated the retreat, covering their men as they pulled back. The young radar operator who had been by Blanton's side was now limping, his leg wounded by shrapnel. Blanton hoisted him onto his shoulder, ignoring the pain in his own battered body. The helicopters finally arrived, their rotors slicing through the smoke-filled air. The first bird touched down, and Secord barked orders for the wounded to be loaded first. Blanton watched as the young operator was lifted onto a stretcher, his face pale but alive. But the evacuation was far from over. The NBA, sensing their victory, intensified their assault. One helicopter was hit by mortar fire as it lifted off, spinning out of control before crashing into the jungle. The remaining choppers hovered precariously, their crews risking everything to save the defenders. Blanton climbed aboard the last helicopter as bullets ricocheted off its hull. He looked down at the burning remains of Lima Site 85, the mountain that had become both a fortress and a graveyard. As the helicopter banked sharply, he caught a final glimpse of the men who hadn't made it, brave souls who had given everything to hold the line. The war would go on, but for the men of Lima Site 85, it had already been lost. As the helicopters disappeared into the horizon, the silence that followed felt like an accusation. Vang Pao, watching from a nearby ridge with his remaining Hmong forces, clenched his fists. They had held their ground as long as they could, but even their sacrifices had not been enough to stop the NBA's relentless assault. Among his men, whispers of betrayal began to circulate. Reports soon confirmed their fears. A local villager, once trusted by the Hmong, had been feeding information to the Pathet Lao for weeks. The NBA's ability to scale the western cliffs, navigate the terrain with such precision, and strike the radar room so effectively was no coincidence. Someone had shown them the way. Vang Pao's heart burned with fury and grief. The betrayal had not only cost lives but had delivered a critical U.S. outpost into enemy hands. Among his men, tension simmered. Revenge would come, but for now, survival took precedence. He signaled his forces to retreat deeper into the mountains, where they could regroup and prepare for the long fight ahead. Miles away, aboard the evacuation helicopters, Blanton and Secord exchanged grim looks. The operation had been a disaster, and the loss of Lima Site 85 would send shockwaves through both the U.S. military and their Laotian allies. Secord turned to Blanton. "This isn't over," he said. "They've won a battle, not the war." Blanton nodded, but the weight of the defeat pressed heavily on him. For now, the priority was making it out alive, and figuring out how the unthinkable had happened. As the survivors regrouped at a CIA safe house, the mood was somber. The questions were endless. How had the NBA breached the supposedly impenetrable defenses? Why had the evacuation been so delayed? And most importantly, who had betrayed them? Secord called an emergency meeting, gathering U.S. personnel, Hmong fighters, and Laotian allies. Tensions were high, each man eyeing the other with suspicion. Blanton, standing near the back, felt the unease ripple through the room. These were men who had fought side by side, but now, doubt gnawed at their unity. "We have credible intel that the Pathet Lao infiltrated local villages," Secord began, his voice sharp. "Someone close to us provided them with detailed maps of the site and our operations." A Hmong fighter stood abruptly. "You accuse us?" he shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "We gave everything to defend that mountain." "No one's accusing anyone yet," Secord said, though his tone carried an edge. "But we need answers." Blanton's gaze shifted to a quiet man in the corner, a Laotian liaison officer who had been unusually reserved throughout the operation. Something about his demeanor felt off, but Blanton kept his suspicions to himself. The truth would surface, but it would take time. For now, trust was a fragile thing, and paranoia threatened to fracture what little remained of their alliance. Meanwhile, on the other side of the conflict, the NBA basked in their victory. The fall of Lima Site 85 was a significant blow to U.S. operations in the region, and the Pathet Lao fighters who had assisted in the attack were hailed as heroes. But even in victory, there was no respite. The Americans would retaliate, and the NBA knew it. Chuong Muk, the NBA commander who had orchestrated the assault, was both celebrated and cautious. He ordered his troops to dismantle the captured radar equipment and move it to a secure location. They had struck a critical blow, but they were deep in enemy territory, and the jungle offered no guarantees. Unbeknownst to Muk, a small team of CIA operatives, including Secord, was already planning a counterstrike. Using aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications, they pinpointed the likely location of the captured equipment. The plan was risky, an airstrike followed by a ground assault to recover or destroy the radar, but it was their only chance to salvage some measure of victory. Blanton volunteered for the mission, despite the dangers. "If they use that radar against us," he said, "every bomber over North Vietnam is at risk. We can't let that happen." The operation launched under the cover of darkness. Two U.S. Air Force AC-47 Spooky gunships provided air support, their miniguns illuminating the jungle below with bursts of fire. On the ground, Blanton and a team of Hmong fighters moved silently toward the NBA camp. The enemy was well prepared. Tripwires and booby traps littered the approach, forcing the team to move painstakingly slow. Every step felt like a gamble, each rustle of leaves a potential death sentence. Blanton's heart pounded as he signaled for the team to halt. A faint glow ahead marked the edge of the NBA encampment. Through his binoculars, Blanton saw the radar equipment being loaded onto trucks. The enemy planned to move it before dawn. Time was running out. Blanton radioed Secord, who was coordinating the operation from a nearby forward base. "Target in sight," he whispered. "Request immediate airstrike." "Confirmed," Secord replied. "Hold your position." The minutes that followed felt like hours. Then, with a deafening roar, U.S fighter jets streaked overhead, dropping bombs with pinpoint precision. The NBA camp erupted into chaos as explosions tore through the jungle. Blanton and his team seized the moment, launching their assault amid the confusion. The firefight was brief but brutal. Blanton found himself face to face with an NBA officer who raised his weapon, only for a Hmong fighter to intercept the shot with his own body. Enraged, Blanton took down the enemy soldier with a burst of fire, but the loss of his comrade was a bitter pill to swallow. As dawn broke, the team emerged from the jungle, battered but victorious. The radar equipment had been destroyed, denying the enemy their prize. But the cost had been high, and the scars of the battle would linger long after the smoke cleared. The success of the raid had momentarily lifted spirits, but it came at a grim cost. Back at the safe house, the survivors of the operation were met with a cold reality: the destruction of the radar equipment wasn't enough. The NBA was still entrenched in the region, and the loss of Lima Site 85 had emboldened them. Richard Secord gathered the remaining operatives and Hmong fighters for a debrief. His voice was steady, but the weight of the situation bore down on him. "We stopped them from using the radar, but the NBA knows we're vulnerable. They'll push harder. We need to hit them before they regroup." Blanton leaned forward, his face etched with exhaustion. "What's the plan?" Secord's eyes narrowed. "There's chatter about a high-ranking Pathet Lao officer moving supplies through a hidden route near the Nam O River. If we can intercept and eliminate him, it'll disrupt their operations and buy us time." The mission was as dangerous as it was critical. The team would insert under the cover of darkness, using gliders to avoid detection. Every man knew the risks. Silent Wings offered no chance for escape if the mission failed. As the gliders launched into the night, Blanton felt a familiar mix of fear and resolve. The jungle loomed below, a vast, unknowable expanse. Somewhere down there, the enemy was waiting. And this time, they couldn't afford to fail. The team landed silently, their gliders skimming just above the treetops before touching down in a clearing. Blanton's boots hit the ground with a soft thud, and he immediately crouched, scanning the darkness for signs of movement. Around him, the others disembarked, their faces tense but determined. They moved quickly, guided by intelligence that suggested the enemy convoy would pass through the area at dawn. Blanton took point, his rifle at the ready. The jungle was alive with sounds, chirping insects, rustling leaves, but every noise felt like a warning. As the first light of day filtered through the canopy, the convoy appeared. A column of trucks and soldiers wound its way along the narrow trail. At its center was the target, a Pathet Lao officer riding in a covered jeep, flanked by heavily armed guards. Blanton signaled the team to hold fire until the convoy reached the kill zone. The seconds stretched into eternity as the trucks rumbled closer. Then, with a single-hand signal from Secord, the ambush began. Explosions tore through the lead and rear vehicles, trapping the convoy in a deadly bottleneck. Gunfire erupted as the team unleashed their attack, cutting through the surprised enemy. Blanton's heart pounded as he sighted the jeep, firing in controlled bursts to suppress the guards. But the enemy wasn't as disorganized as they'd hoped. From the surrounding jungle, additional NBA troops emerged, their counterattack swift and brutal. Blanton's stomach sank as he realized the convoy had been bait, an elaborate trap designed to lure them into a firefight they couldn't win. Pinned down by heavy fire, the team fought desperately to hold their ground. The ambush had turned into a bloody standoff, with both sides taking heavy casualties. Blanton, crouched behind a fallen tree, reloaded his rifle with shaking hands. Around him, the jungle echoed with the screams of wounded men and a deafening roar of gunfire. Secord crawled over, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. "We're outnumbered. Extraction's off the table." Blanton nodded grimly. "What's the fallback?" Secord hesitated. "We have to split up. Smaller groups have a better chance of slipping through the lines. Rendezvous at the secondary site." Blanton's heart sank. Splitting up meant leaving behind the wounded and risking capture, or worse. But there was no other option. He gathered his group, which included a young Hmong fighter with a gunshot wound to the leg. "We're not leaving you behind," Blanton told him firmly. "Lean on me." As they moved through the jungle, the enemy pursued relentlessly. Blanton's group was forced to navigate treacherous terrain, avoiding booby traps and patrols at every turn. The air was thick with tension, each step a gamble. At one point, they stumbled upon a shallow riverbed. Blanton paused, his instincts screaming at him to stop. The water was too still, too quiet. He motioned for the group to hold, scanning the area. Then he saw it, a tripwire, barely visible in the morning light. They disarmed it carefully, but the delay cost them precious time. In the distance, the sound of barking dogs grew louder. The NBA was closing in. By nightfall, Blanton's group was exhausted, their movements slowed by the wounded fighter they refused to abandon. The dense jungle provided cover, but it also amplified their fears. Every shadow felt like an enemy soldier, every rustle of leaves carried the threat of discovery. As they approached the rendezvous point, Blanton noticed something strange, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. He raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. "Stay low," he whispered. Creeping closer, they discovered a small NBA camp, hastily assembled and poorly guarded. Blanton realized it was a supply cache, likely part of the bait operation they'd stumbled into earlier. Among the crates, he spotted something that made his blood run cold, maps of the region, including detailed plans for future operations. "This is it," Blanton whispered to the Hmong fighter beside him. "This is how they're staying ahead of us." The group moved to sabotage the supplies, rigging the area with explosives. But as they prepared to leave, a patrol returned unexpectedly, forcing them into a firefight. Blanton covered the team's retreat, his rifle barking in the darkness. The explosions lit up the jungle behind them as they fled, the enemy camp reduced to rubble. Blanton's group pressed on, their spirits buoyed by the small victory. But as they reached the rendezvous point, only silence greeted them. The others hadn't made it yet, or worse, they wouldn't be coming at all. The night was heavy with uncertainty as Blanton's group huddled in the undergrowth near the rendezvous point. The absence of the other teams gnawed at their morale, each second stretching into an eternity. Blanton scanned the darkness, his rifle clutched tightly, his ears straining for the faintest sound. The young Hmong fighter, leaning against a tree to catch his breath, broke the silence. "What if no one else comes?" "They'll come," Blanton said firmly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He glanced at his watch. They had a narrow window to wait before moving to the emergency fallback point. Any longer, and the jungle would swallow them whole. Then they heard it, a faint rustling in the brush. The group froze, their weapons raised. Blanton signaled for silence, his heart pounding in his chest. The rustling grew louder, closer. A shadow emerged from the trees, and Blanton nearly fired before recognizing Secord's silhouette. "We're not alone," Secord said urgently, his voice low but steady. "Enemy patrols are sweeping the area." They know we're here. Blanton's relief was short-lived. Sequard's group had been ambushed during their retreat. They'd lost 2 men, and the remaining survivors were scattered. The enemy had tightened their net, and escape now seemed impossible. "We need to move," Sequard said. "They're herding us toward the river. If we wait here, we're dead." Moving under cover of darkness, the combined group pushed deeper into the jungle, avoiding well-trodden paths and sticking to terrain the enemy was less likely to patrol. The air was thick with tension, every step a reminder that danger lurked in every shadow. Blanton noticed something odd as they moved. The enemy wasn't just pursuing them, they were driving them. Subtle cues, like distant gunfire and the sudden appearance of flares, seemed calculated to corral the survivors into a specific direction. Blanton shared his suspicions with Sequard. "They're not just chasing us," Blanton said. "They're steering us toward something." Sequard nodded grimly. "Probably the river. They know it's our only viable escape route." The realization struck Blanton like a punch. It's a trap. They'll have the river locked down. Despite the grim prediction, the group had no choice. They reached the river by dawn, only to find their worst fears confirmed. NVA troops lined the far bank, their weapons trained on the water. Patrol boats cruised along the current, cutting off any hope of crossing undetected. Blanton scanned the scene, his mind racing. The group was trapped between the river and the pursuing patrols. The only way out was through the enemy, but the odds were grim. As the group debated their next move, a distant hum cut through the morning air. Blanton squinted at the horizon, spotting a small aircraft approaching from the south. It was an old T-28, one of the Hmong-operated planes used to support guerrilla operations. Vang Pao's forces hadn't abandoned them after all. The plane dove low, strafing the enemy positions with machine gun fire. The NVA troops scrambled for cover as explosions ripped through their lines. The sudden chaos bought the group precious time. "This is our chance," Sequard shouted. "Move!" Blanton led the charge, his rifle blazing as the group pushed toward the river. The NVA, caught off guard, fought to regroup, but the relentless attacks from the T-28 kept them pinned down. Blanton waded into the water, pulling the wounded Hmong fighter alongside him as bullets hissed past. The patrol boats turned their attention to the escaping group, their machine guns roaring. Blanton dug beneath the surface, the cold water numbing his senses. When he surfaced, he saw the young Hmong fighter struggling to stay afloat, his strength fading. "Hold on!" Blanton shouted, grabbing the boy's arm. Together, they fought their way across the river, the chaos behind them fading into the distance. By the time the group reached the far bank, they were battered and exhausted. The jungle provided a temporary refuge, but the cost of their escape was written on every face. Of the original team, only a handful remained. The Hmong fighter who had fought so bravely succumbed to his wounds shortly after they reached safety. Blanton sat silently beside the boy's body, his hands trembling. He had seen death before, but this loss felt personal. These men, young, untrained, and outnumbered, had given everything for a mission they barely understood. The weight of their sacrifice bore down on him. Sequard approached, his face grim but resolute. "We have to keep moving. The NVA won't stop." Blanton nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. As they prepared to continue their journey, he noticed something strange about the maps they had retrieved from the enemy camp. One of them contained markings that didn't match known supply routes. It was a coded grid, coordinates leading to something significant. This wasn't just a trap, Blanton said, showing the map to Secord. They were protecting something. Whatever's at these coordinates, it's important. Secord studied the map, his expression darkening. If it's what I think it is, this operation isn't over. Not by a long shot. Back at a safe house deep in the jungle, Secord decrypted the coordinates with the help of local intelligence. The grid pointed to a hidden NBA command post, a critical hub for coordinating operations in the region. Its destruction could cripple the enemy's ability to mount further offensives. Blanton leaned over the map, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. This isn't just about revenge, he said. If we hit that command post, we can turn the tide. Secord nodded. It's a long shot, but it's our best chance. We'll need air support, local guides, and whatever weapons we can scrounge up. The mission was set for the following night. As Blanton prepared his gear, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just another operation. The men they had lost, the sacrifices they had made, it all led to this. But the jungle had its own rules, and the enemy was as cunning as they were relentless. As the team moved out, Blanton couldn't help but wonder, had they uncovered a weakness, or were they walking into the enemy's deadliest trap yet? The jungle was alive with sound, a cacophony of insects and distant animal calls that masked the team's movements. Blanton led the way, his senses sharpened by the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Behind him, Secord and the others moved in silence, their eyes scanning the dense foliage for any sign of danger. The NDA command post lay deep within enemy territory, concealed in a valley surrounded by sheer cliffs. Intelligence suggested it was heavily guarded, but the team had one advantage: the enemy didn't know they were coming. Armed with explosives and the element of surprise, the group was determined to strike a decisive blow. As they neared the valley, the air grew heavier, the oppressive heat sapping their strength. Blanton signaled for the group to halt, crouching low as he observed the enemy camp through binoculars. The scene below was a hive of activity. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, while trucks ferried supplies to and from the central structure. "This is it," Secord whispered. "We hit the supply depot first, then move on the command building. Keep it quiet until we're in position." Blanton nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. The odds were stacked against them, but there was no turning back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the jungle, the team prepared for their most dangerous mission yet. The darkness provided cover as the team slipped into the camp. Blanton's heart pounded as they approached the supply depot, a cluster of wooden structures filled with ammunition and fuel. Every step felt like a gamble, the risk of discovery hanging over them like a sword. Secord motioned for Blanton to plant the charges while the others covered him. Moving quickly, Blanton placed the explosives along the fuel barrels, his hands steady despite the tension. He finished just as a pair of NBA soldiers rounded the corner. Blanton froze, his breath caught in his throat. The soldiers exchanged a few words, their laughter breaking the silence. Then one of them stepped closer, his flashlight sweeping dangerously close to Blanton's position. Time seemed to slow as Blanton reached for his knife, preparing for a fight. Before he could act, a silenced shot rang out, and the soldier crumpled to the ground. Secord stepped from the shadows, his pistol raised. The second soldier barely had time to react before another shot silenced him. Blanton exhaled, nodding his thanks. The charges were set. As the team retreated to a safe distance, Blanton triggered the detonator. The explosion lit up the night sky, a fiery plume that engulfed the depot and sent shockwaves through the camp. Chaos erupted as NBA soldiers scrambled to respond. "Time to move," Secord said, his voice calm despite the chaos. The command building's next. The explosion had drawn most of the enemy forces to the burning depot, leaving the path to the command building lightly guarded. The team moved swiftly, using the confusion to their advantage. Blanton led the charge, his rifle at the ready. As they approached the building, a guard emerged from the shadows, his rifle raised. Blanton fired first, the shot echoing in the night. The guard fell, but the noise alerted the remaining soldiers. The element of surprise was gone. Gunfire erupted as the team stormed the building. Blanton ducked behind cover, returning fire as bullets tore through the walls. The enemy fought with desperation, their determination to protect the command post evident in their ferocity. Secord motioned for the team to flank the enemy. Blanton and a Hmong fighter moved around the side of the building, slipping through an open window. Inside, the command room was in disarray, papers scattered, radios crackling with frantic orders. Blanton spotted the target, a senior officer barking commands into a radio. Without hesitation, Blanton raised his rifle and fired. The officer fell, the radio slipping from his grasp. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of flames from the depot outside. With the command post secured, the team quickly set to work gathering intelligence. Secord rifled through the scattered documents, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered. "They're planning a major offensive." Blanton glanced at the papers. Maps marked with troop movements and supply lines painted a grim picture. The NBA wasn't just consolidating their position, they were preparing to push deeper into Laos, threatening to overrun key U.S. and Allied positions. "We need to get this back to command," Secord said. "But first, we finish the job." The team planted charges throughout the building, rigging it to collapse. As they retreated, Blanton triggered the explosives. The blast was deafening, reducing the command post to rubble and sending a clear message to the enemy: they weren't invincible. But the victory was short-lived. As the team made their escape, the jungle came alive with the sound of pursuit. The NBA, enraged by the attack, was closing in fast. Blanton's heart raced as they sprinted through the undergrowth, bullets whizzing past. By the time they reached the extraction point, the team was exhausted, their bodies pushed to the limit. A U.S. helicopter hovered above the clearing, its rotors kicking up dust and debris. Secord signaled for the team to board, his voice barely audible over the noise. Blanton was the last to climb aboard, firing his rifle at the pursuing enemy until the helicopter lifted off. As the jungle fell away beneath them, he felt a mix of relief and sorrow. They had survived, but the cost had been high. As the helicopter sped towards safety, Secord turned to Blanton. "We hit them hard, but this war isn't over." "Not by a long shot." Blanton nodded, staring out at the jungle below. The operation had come to an end, but the fight for Laos, and the lives of those who called it home, was far from finished. The Battle of Bumla. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and sweat, the cries of the wounded blending with the relentless hum of circling aircraft. In the heart of Laos, the valley of Bumlang lay nestled like a forgotten jewel, surrounded by 3 imposing mountains. What should have been a tranquil sanctuary had become a theater of unending conflict. The year was 1969, and Bumlang, a fortified royalist outpost, was under siege. Major Sher Pao Mua stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, his binoculars trained on the horizon. He could see the faint silhouettes of the communist forces assembling, their numbers growing with every passing hour. Behind him, the Auto Defense Chok, ADC, militia, a ragtag group of Hmong guerrillas, readied themselves for the inevitable clash. These were farmers turned fighters, defending their land with a resolve that belied their lack of formal training. The valley's strategic position had made it a target for years. Supported by the CIA, Bumlang had become a hub of guerrilla operations, launching missions like Operation Raindance to disrupt communist supply lines. Yet, this time, the enemy seemed more determined than ever. The People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, and Pathet Lao forces had encircled the valley, cutting off supply routes and bombarding the defenses with relentless artillery fire. As the sun dipped below the mountains, the first wave of attackers surged forward. The ground trembled under the weight of mortar shells, and the defenders opened fire, their bullets tearing through the twilight. Major Mua shouted orders, his voice steady despite the chaos. But deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The valley of Bumlang, once a beacon of resistance, now teetered on the brink of collapse. In the darkness, the air vibrated with an otherworldly roar. The communist forces paused, their advance faltering as two AC-47 gunships appeared in the night sky. Known as Spooky by the defenders, these aircraft unleashed a storm of bullets, their Gatling guns lighting up the battlefield like fireworks. From his command post, Major Mua watched as the gunships decimated the enemy ranks. But even as the tide turned, he knew the respite was temporary. The communists would regroup, their determination unyielding. He glanced at a map spread out before him, noting the weak points in their defenses. Bumlang's survival depended on exploiting every advantage. Amid the chaos, a young ADC soldier named Chow, barely 17, clutched his rifle tightly. This was his first battle, and fear gripped him like a vice. Yet, as he saw the gunships overhead, a spark of hope ignited within him. He fired into the shadows, his aim steady despite his trembling hands. Unbeknownst to the defenders, the communist forces were not retreating, they were repositioning. Deep in the jungle, sappers armed with explosives crawled toward the perimeter, their movements concealed by the dense foliage. The gunships, focused on the main assault, missed the creeping danger. By the time the defenders realized the threat, it might already be too late. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant rumble of the gunships. Major Mua sensed something was amiss. He dispatched a reconnaissance team to scout the jungle, their mission fraught with peril. Among them was Chow, who had volunteered despite his inexperience. The jungle was a maze of shadows and whispers, the silence amplifying every snap of a twig. The team moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the underbrush. Suddenly, a tripwire snapped, and an explosion shattered the stillness. Chow was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. When he regained his senses, he saw the mangled remains of his comrades. Fear threatened to paralyze him, but he forced himself to move. He crawled through the underbrush, his heart pounding as he spotted the sappers. They were planting charges along the perimeter, their movements precise and calculated. Chow knew he had to act. He aimed his rifle, his hand steady despite his racing heart. With a deep breath, he fired, taking down one of the sappers. The others scattered, their plan disrupted. Chow's actions had bought the defenders precious time, but he knew the danger was far from over. As dawn broke over Bumlang, the defenders surveyed the aftermath of the night's skirmish. The sappers' attack had been thwarted, but at a heavy cost. The bodies of fallen soldiers were gathered, their sacrifices a grim reminder of the stakes. Major Mua convened a meeting with his officers. The enemy's tactics were becoming more sophisticated, their resolve unshaken. Supplies were running low, and morale was beginning to waver. Yet, the thought of surrender was unthinkable. Bumlang was more than a stronghold, it was a symbol of resistance. Meanwhile, Chow struggled to process the horrors he had witnessed. The faces of his fallen comrades haunted him, their sacrifice weighing heavily on his conscience. Yet, amid the despair, he found strength in their memory. He vowed to honor them by continuing the fight. Unbeknownst to the defenders, reinforcements were en route. 2 more AC-47 gunships and a fresh wave of supplies would arrive within days. But until then, the defenders of Bumlang would have to hold their ground, their fate hanging by a thread. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley, a new threat emerged, not from the jungle but from within. Major Mua had long suspected that communist sympathizers had infiltrated the civilian population taking refuge in Bumlang. Now, as tensions grew and food supplies dwindled, whispers of discontent spread like wildfire. Among the villagers, an elderly man named Vang Zai moved quietly through the crowds, his demeanor unassuming. Few suspected that he had been passing information to the enemy for weeks. The communists had promised safety for his family in exchange for intelligence, a promise he could not ignore. That night, Vang Zai slipped away into the jungle under the cover of darkness, carrying a hand-drawn map of Bumlang's defenses. Meanwhile, Major Mua sensed something was wrong. The enemy's attacks had grown increasingly precise, targeting weak points in their fortifications with uncanny accuracy. His suspicions led him to organize a covert watch over the civilian population. Chow, still grappling with his fear but eager to prove himself, volunteered for the task. As Chow patrolled the perimeter, he noticed faint footprints leading away from the village. He followed them into the jungle, his pulse quickening. Hours later, he stumbled upon a gruesome scene, Vang Zai's lifeless body hanging from a tree, the map torn and discarded beneath him. The communists had taken what they needed and silenced their informant. Chow returned to the camp, his heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. The next morning, the defenders awoke to a cacophony of artillery fire. The communists launched a ferocious assault, their forces advancing under the cover of smoke and chaos. It was a full frontal attack, and for a moment, it seemed as if Bumlang's defenses would crumble. Major Mua, however, remained calm. He realized the attack was a diversion. The true threat lay elsewhere. He ordered his men to hold the line while dispatching a small team, led by Chow, to investigate the eastern ridge, a vulnerable flank that had been eerily quiet. As Chow's team climbed the ridge, they encountered a group of communist sappers preparing to detonate charges that would collapse the eastern fortifications. A tense firefight erupted, the crack of gunfire echoing through the mountains. Despite their inexperience, Chow's team managed to neutralize the threat, but not without casualties. The diversion had failed, but the cost was steep. As Chow returned to the camp, bloodied and exhausted, he found himself questioning how long they could endure. The enemy's tactics were evolving, their assaults relentless. Yet, for every inch of ground the communists sought to claim, the defenders of Bumlang paid in blood to deny them. By the third day, reinforcements finally arrived. 2 more AC-47 gunships roared into the valley, their arrival met with cheers from the beleaguered defenders. With fresh supplies and firepower, morale surged. For a brief moment, hope seemed tangible. But hope was fleeting in Bumlang. That night, the communists unleashed a devastating new weapon, incendiary rounds. The sky lit up with streaks of fire as their artillery rained destruction upon the valley. Wooden structures ignited instantly, and the flames spread with terrifying speed. Major Mua barked orders, directing his men to contain the fires while maintaining their defensive positions. Chaos reigned as civilians and soldiers scrambled to save what little they could. Amid the inferno, Chow found himself leading a group of villagers to safety, his own fear eclipsed by the urgency of the moment. As dawn broke, the defenders surveyed the devastation. Half the camp lay in ruins, and the loss of supplies was catastrophic. Yet, the communists had underestimated the resilience of Bumlang's defenders. The fires had scarred the land but not the resolve of those who called it home. The loss of supplies forced Major Mua to make a desperate decision. He sent a small, elite team on a high-risk mission to intercept an enemy convoy transporting food and ammunition. The team, led by a seasoned guerrilla named Seng, set out under the cover of darkness. Seng was a legend among the Hmong fighters, known as the Ghost of the Valley, for his ability to strike without warning and vanish into the jungle. His reputation alone struck fear into the hearts of the enemy. Yet, this mission would test even his limits. The convoy was heavily guarded, its path winding through treacherous terrain. Seng's team ambushed the convoy at a narrow pass, their attack swift and brutal. Explosions rocked the night as they disabled vehicles and eliminated the guards. But as they secured the supplies, they discovered a chilling twist. The convoy carried not only food and ammunition but also prisoners, villagers from Bumlang, captured and used as human shields. Faced with an impossible choice, Seng ordered his team to free the prisoners while defending their position. The firefight that followed was brutal, but Seng's leadership and cunning turned the tide. The team returned to Bumlang with the supplies and the rescued villagers, their victory a rare glimmer of light in the darkness of war. The jungle was unnervingly quiet in the days following the raid on the convoy. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Major Mua, ever vigilant, knew the enemy was regrouping. His suspicions were confirmed when a captured scout revealed a chilling plan. The communists were digging tunnels under Bumlang's defenses. The revelation sent shockwaves through the camp. The enemy's ingenuity was both terrifying and impressive. Tunnels would allow them to bypass the fortified peaks and strike directly at the heart of the valley. If they succeeded, Bumlang would fall. Mua organized nightly patrols to detect and disrupt the tunneling. Chow, now gaining a reputation for his sharp instincts, was assigned to lead one such patrol. As his team crept through the dense jungle, they stumbled upon a hidden tunnel entrance, guarded by a handful of soldiers. What followed was a tense and deadly encounter. The patrol engaged the guards in a swift firefight, silencing them before detonating the tunnel entrance. But Chow noticed something peculiar, a set of fresh tracks leading away from the site. He followed them, discovering another tunnel in progress, its entrance hidden beneath thick foliage. The enemy had been using decoy tunnels to distract the defenders. Chow's discovery saved the camp from imminent disaster, but it also revealed the depth of the enemy's strategy. The communists were playing a long game, and Bumlang was running out of time. Tensions within the camp reached a boiling point. The discovery of the tunnels raised an unsettling question: how had the enemy pinpointed the valley's vulnerabilities so accurately? Major Mua suspected there was still a spy within their ranks. A secret investigation was launched, with Mua entrusting only his most loyal officers. They quietly monitored the movements of soldiers and civilians, searching for patterns or suspicious behavior. The strain of constant suspicion began to wear on everyone, breeding paranoia and mistrust. One night, during a routine supply check, a soldier named Feng was caught tampering with a radio transmitter. Under interrogation, Feng confessed to passing information to the enemy in exchange for promises of safe passage for his family. His betrayal cut deep, as Feng had been a respected member of the ADC militia. The camp held a somber tribunal, and Feng was sentenced to death. His execution was swift, but the emotional toll lingered. Major Mua addressed his troops, reminding them of the stakes and urging unity. Yet, the seeds of doubt had been sown, and the defenders of Bumlang were now fighting battles on two fronts, against the enemy outside and the fear within. The communists, undeterred by the setbacks, launched a bold new offensive. A column of their forces advanced under the cover of night, their movements shrouded in secrecy. But Bumlang's defenders, emboldened by their recent victories, had learned to anticipate the enemy's moves. Major Mua devised a plan to lure the advancing forces into a trap. He sent a decoy team to feign retreat, drawing the enemy into a narrow gorge. Hidden along the ridges were the bulk of the ADC militia, armed and ready. As the communist forces entered the gorge, the defenders unleashed a devastating ambush. Gunfire and explosions erupted from all sides, trapping the enemy in a deadly crossfire. The valley echoed with the chaos of battle, the defenders' cheers mingling with the screams of the wounded. But the victory was bittersweet. Among the casualties was Seng, the legendary Ghost of the Valley. Struck by enemy fire while leading the ambush, Seng's loss was a heavy blow to the defenders. His death was a stark reminder of the cost of war, even in moments of triumph. In the aftermath of the ambush, a curious discovery was made. Among the enemy's abandoned supplies were maps and documents detailing hidden weapons caches scattered throughout the jungle. These caches, if located, could provide the defenders with much-needed firepower. Major Mua dispatched several teams to investigate, each tasked with finding and securing the caches. Chow, now a trusted leader despite his youth, was assigned to one such mission. His team navigated the treacherous terrain, their journey fraught with danger. After days of searching, Chow's team found one of the caches buried beneath a collapsed tree. The cache contained rifles, ammunition, and mortar rounds, enough to bolster Bumlang's defenses significantly. But as they prepared to transport the supplies back to camp, they were ambushed by a communist patrol. A fierce firefight ensued, with Chow and his team outnumbered and outgunned. Thinking quickly, Chow used one of the captured mortars to launch a surprise counterattack, forcing the enemy to retreat. His ingenuity and courage saved the mission, but the encounter left him shaken. The weapons cache was secured, but the experience reminded Chow of the thin line between survival and death. As the team returned to Bumlang, they knew the war was far from over. Each victory came at a price, and the enemy was relentless. The return of Chow's team with the hidden arsenal injected a sense of renewed hope into Bumlang. Yet, that hope was fragile, hanging by a thread as whispers of a looming attack circulated through the camp. The captured documents hinted at a large-scale communist offensive, one that would come from multiple directions. Major Mua convened his officers in the makeshift command center. "They want to break us with fear," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. But fear is a weapon that cuts both ways. His plan was daring: use the enemy's anticipated assault as an opportunity to launch a counterstrike, hitting their staging grounds before they could mobilize. The defenders moved swiftly under the cover of darkness. Guided by the maps they had recovered, they navigated treacherous jungle paths to a hidden communist camp nestled deep in a ravine. What they found there shocked them. The camp wasn't just a staging ground, it was a command post, with senior communist officers coordinating the broader campaign. Mua hesitated for a brief moment. Destroying the camp could cripple the enemy's plans, but the risk of retaliation was enormous. He gave the order, and the defenders launched a surprise attack, demolishing the camp with precision strikes. Yet, in the chaos, a lone communist officer escaped into the jungle, clutching a set of maps that revealed Bumlang's most vulnerable points. Days after the raid, the storm finally broke. The communists unleashed a massive, coordinated assault, attacking Bumrang from 3 directions. Artillery shells rained down like thunder, tearing through defenses and sending shockwaves through the valley. Major Mua stood firm, barking orders as his men scrambled to hold the line. The defenders fought with everything they had, using the captured arsenal to repel wave after wave of attackers. The air was thick with smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire, but the defenders refused to yield. Amid the chaos, Chao found himself in the thick of the fighting, his rifle a lifeline in the maelstrom. He was stationed at the eastern ridge, where the enemy's sappers had concentrated their efforts. As the enemy breached the perimeter, Chao rallied his comrades, leading a desperate counterattack that pushed the communists back. But just as the defenders began to regroup, an explosion rocked the command post. The lone communist officer who had escaped the earlier raid had used the stolen maps to direct a precision strike. Major Mua was injured in the blast, leaving the camp's leadership in disarray. As night fell, the defenders faced a grim reality: they were on their own. The eastern ridge, already weakened by relentless assaults, became the focal point of the enemy's advance. With Major Mua incapacitated, the responsibility of holding the line fell to Captain Sengchai, a stoic but untested officer. He quickly devised a desperate plan: hold the ridge at all costs while preparing a fallback position at the valley's center. Chao, now hardened by weeks of relentless combat, was among those tasked with defending the ridge. The defenders fortified their positions with sandbags and scavenged supplies, bracing for what they knew would be a brutal fight. At dawn, the enemy struck. Mortar rounds exploded with deafening force, and the ridge was engulfed in chaos. The defenders fought fiercely, their resolve unbroken despite the odds. Chao manned a machine gun, his fingers numb from the relentless firing. Each round he fired felt like a heartbeat, a rhythm of survival in the face of annihilation. As the enemy closed in, a sudden twist changed the tide. Reinforcements arrived, not from outside but from within. Civilians, armed with makeshift weapons, joined the fight, their courage a testament to Bumrang's unyielding spirit. Together, they pushed the enemy back, the ridge holding firm against the onslaught. In the aftermath of the battle, a chilling discovery sent shockwaves through the camp. Among the bodies of the fallen was a familiar face, a soldier from Bumrang, wearing the insignia of the communist forces. The implications were devastating: the enemy had infiltrated their ranks again. Captain Sengchai ordered an immediate investigation. The camp was locked down, and every soldier and civilian was questioned. Fear and paranoia gripped the valley as rumors of further infiltrators spread. Chao, now trusted by the leadership, was tasked with monitoring the investigation. As the days wore on, Chao noticed strange behavior from one of the supply clerks, a man named Tu. Tu had always been quiet, blending into the background, but his nervous glances and unexplained absences raised suspicion. Chao followed him one night, tracking him to a hidden radio transmitter buried near the western perimeter. Confronted, Tu confessed to being a sleeper agent, planted months ago to feed information to the communists. His betrayal was met with swift justice, but the damage had been done. The enemy's ability to sow discord from within was a stark reminder of the fragile line between loyalty and survival. With the infiltrator dealt with, Bumrang's defenders worked tirelessly to rebuild their shattered defenses. Yet, even as they patched the holes in their walls, an invisible threat loomed over the camp. The discovery of Tu's hidden radio raised an unsettling question: how much information had he transmitted before being caught? Major Mua, recovering from his injuries, ordered the camp's radio frequencies to be changed and communication protocols tightened. But something strange began to happen. Late at night, static-laden transmissions crackled through their radios, disjointed phrases, coordinates, and eerie silences. The signals seemed to be coming from within their own territory. Chow, tasked with investigating the phantom radio signals, set out with a small team to locate the source. They combed through the dense jungle, following the faint signals to a derelict outpost that had been abandoned months earlier. Inside, they found a transmitter broadcasting automated messages, its battery running on a hidden solar panel. The messages were coded, their meaning unclear. But as Chow's team scoured the outpost, they discovered something far more chilling, a map marked with the locations of Bumlang's ammunition stores and fallback positions. The communists had left this trap as a diversion, a ghost signal to lure the defenders into exposing themselves. Chow's quick thinking prevented a disaster, but the psychological toll of the enemy's cunning was undeniable. Bumlang's supplies were critically low, and with the main supply routes compromised, Major Mua devised a risky plan to bait the enemy while securing resources. A convoy of decoy vehicles would travel through the jungle, mimicking a supply run. The real supplies, meanwhile, would be smuggled in by foot through a hidden trail. The decoy convoy, led by Captain Senchai, was loaded with empty crates and barrels to create the illusion of valuable cargo. As the convoy set off, the defenders braced themselves for the inevitable ambush. The enemy would not pass up such an opportunity. The ambush came swiftly. Communist forces descended upon the convoy, their gunfire tearing through the jungle. Senkai's team fought valiantly, buying time for the real supplies to reach Bumlang. But the enemy quickly realized the ruse, and their fury was palpable. In a desperate bid to escape, Senchai ordered his men to split up, leading the enemy on a wild chase through the dense jungle. The diversion worked, but at a steep cost. Many of the decoy team did not return, their sacrifice ensuring the survival of Bumlang for a little longer. The communists, undeterred by their failures, returned to their earlier strategy, tunneling. This time, their efforts were more calculated, their engineers constructing a network of tunnels designed to bypass Bumlang's defenses entirely. The defenders knew the threat was imminent but lacked the manpower to launch a direct assault on the tunneling sites. Major Mua turned to an unconventional tactic, flooding the tunnels. Using intelligence gathered from captured documents and scouts, he identified a key entry point near a river. A team of engineers, escorted by Chow and his squad, rigged explosives to redirect the river's flow into the tunnels. The operation was fraught with danger. The enemy, realizing the plan, launched a surprise attack to stop the flooding. The firefight was brutal, with bullets ricocheting off rocks and explosions lighting up the jungle. Chow's team held their ground, allowing the engineers to complete their task. As the river's waters surged into the tunnels, the defenders heard the muffled cries of the trapped enemy forces. The tunnels collapsed under the weight of the water, and the immediate threat was neutralized. Yet, the victory was bittersweet, the haunting echoes of the enemy's desperation lingering in the defenders' minds. Days later, the defenders awoke to an ominous sight. The horizon was ablaze with red, a massive fire raging in the jungle. The communists had set the surrounding forest alight, using the inferno as both a weapon and a shield. The fire drove wildlife into the valley, sowing chaos among the defenders. Amid the panic, Major Mua realized the enemy's strategy. The fire wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a cover for their advancing forces. The smoke obscured visibility, and the defenders struggled to spot the enemy's movements. Chow, now a seasoned fighter, was sent on a dangerous mission to locate the advancing forces. With a small team, he navigated the burning jungle, the heat and smoke choking their every breath. What they found was alarming. the enemy had split into multiple units, each targeting a different part of the valley. Chow raced back to warn the camp, but the journey was perilous. His team was ambushed by an enemy patrol, and a desperate firefight ensued. Chow was wounded but managed to escape, carrying the vital intelligence back to Bumwang. The defenders prepared for the onslaught, their resolve unbroken despite the odds. As the enemy closed in under the cover of smoke and fire, Bumwang braced for its fiercest battle yet. The jungle fire raged with unrelenting ferocity, its heat blistering and its smoke suffocating. For the defenders of Bumwang, it was as if the valley itself had turned against them. Major Mua, still recovering but back in command, issued clear directives: fortify positions, focus on survival, and maintain constant vigilance. The fire forced both defenders and civilians into makeshift shelters dug into the valley floor. Meanwhile, Chow, his arm hastily bandaged from his recent wound, coordinated a network of lookouts to monitor the enemy's approach. The smoke provided perfect cover for the communists, and their attacks became sporadic yet devastating, striking seemingly at random. Late that night, as the defenders braced for another assault, a low rumble shook the valley. The fire had reached a hidden ammunition cache abandoned by the enemy during their retreat. The resulting explosion lit up the night sky, momentarily blinding both sides. The defenders, using the chaos to their advantage, launched a counteroffensive, driving back the attackers from the eastern ridge. But the victory came at a cost. The explosion had weakened the natural barriers around the valley, creating gaps that the enemy could exploit. Major Mua knew that Bumwang's defenses were now dangerously fragile, and the next attack could very well be their last. The communists struck at dawn, their forces converging on the weakened eastern gate. The defenders, exhausted from days of unrelenting assaults, scrambled to hold the line. Chow found himself in the thick of the battle, his rifle an extension of his will to survive. The enemy's tactics were ruthless. They used the fire's lingering smoke to obscure their movements, launching waves of infantry supported by mortar fire. The defenders retaliated with everything they had: machine guns, grenades, and even captured weapons from previous skirmishes. Amid the chaos, a chilling realization swept through the defenders: the enemy was not retreating as they had in previous battles. This was a fight to the death. Major Mua, understanding the stakes, called for an emergency airstrike to halt the enemy's advance. As the first planes roared overhead, dropping their payloads with precision, the tide began to turn. The airstrikes decimated the enemy's front line, forcing a temporary retreat. The defenders had held the eastern gate, but the cost was staggering. Bodies littered the battlefield, and the valley was eerily silent as the smoke began to clear. With the eastern gate secured, Major Mua knew the communists would not relent. Their strategy had shifted from wearing down the defenders to overwhelming them with sheer numbers. Reports from scouts confirmed the worst: the enemy was amassing their largest force yet, preparing for a final, decisive assault. The defenders worked tirelessly to prepare. Trenches were deepened, sandbags reinforced, and makeshift barricades erected. Every able-bodied person, including civilians, was armed and trained. Chow, now regarded as a leader among his peers, took charge of a small unit tasked with defending the valley's northern flank. The attack came under the cover of night. The communists unleashed a barrage of artillery fire, followed by waves of infantry. The defenders fought valiantly, their determination unwavering despite the overwhelming odds. Chow's unit held their ground, repelling wave after wave of attackers with brutal efficiency. But the enemy's numbers were endless. As dawn broke, the defenders found themselves surrounded, their line stretched to the breaking point. Major Mua, his voice hoarse from shouting orders, made a grim decision: they would retreat to the Central Valley and make their last stand there. The Central Valley became a fortress, its natural barriers augmented with every resource the defenders could muster. The remaining civilians were evacuated to hidden caves, and the soldiers prepared for what they knew would be their final battle. The communists attacked with relentless fury, their artillery pounding the valley's defenses. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Chow, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, led his unit in a daring counterattack, using the terrain to ambush the enemy and inflict heavy casualties. Amid the chaos, a plot twist emerged. Unbeknownst to the defenders, a faction within the communist ranks had grown disillusioned with their leader's tactics. This faction, led by a mid-ranking officer, staged a mutiny, creating confusion and disarray among the attackers. Seizing the opportunity, Major Mua ordered a coordinated counteroffensive. The defenders pushed back with everything they had, driving the enemy out of the valley. By nightfall, the battle was over. The valley of Bumlang, scarred but unbroken, had survived. The battle for Bumlang marked the end of the communist offensive. Their forces, crippled by heavy losses and internal strife, withdrew to regroup. For the defenders, the victory was bittersweet. The valley was a graveyard, its fields littered with the remnants of war. Major Mua stood on a ridge, surveying the aftermath. He knew that Bumlang's survival was a testament to the resilience and courage of its defenders, but he also knew the war was far from over. The Laotian Civil War would continue, and Bumlang would remain a symbol of resistance. Chow, now a hardened veteran, reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had witnessed the best and worst of humanity, experienced loss and triumph, and emerged stronger for it. As he prepared for the battles yet to come, he vowed to honor the sacrifices of those who had fought and fallen beside him.